Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and we are here for my LPL Week 3 overview, analysis, and of course, at the end, my updated power rankings. I'm very excited to make this video. Obviously, LPL has been on a little bit of a hiatus because of the Lunar New Year that came and went, so we are back here in the LPL now, and I'm very excited to get back into the swing of things, of course. The first 2 weeks here in the LPL across the beginning of the season in 2023 were shortened. They wanted to save a lot of the games until after Lunar New Year, and so we're really getting into the thick of things now. We're finally getting a full LPL week with 7 days. That's correct, 7 days worth of games, so I'm very excited to talk about it. The last games just wrapped up as of the time of this recording, and so I hope you guys are as excited as I am. Let me know down in the comment section below what series and what games were your favorite of the LPL over the course of this week. There were a lot of really good options, and I'm really excited to hear what you guys think of a lot of these teams. But without further ado, let's not waste too much time. Let's go ahead and jump right into the beginning of the week, starting off with day number 1. And kicking off day number 1 for us was a matchup between LGD Gaming and, oh my god, OMG. And OMG is able to take the 2-0 series win here. This is a very good sign for an OMG team that I think was in a little bit of flux, at least before the Lunar New Year. They weren't able to take down RNG in a series. That did kind of concern me, and I think in hindsight that looks even worse because RNG certainly has struggled quite a bit since then. But OMG picking up a really solid win here against a team that they absolutely should beat. And I still have a lot of faith in this roster. I was very high on them going into the year. I originally had them ranked number 7 in my power rankings when we started the season. Of course, they ended up just dropping below NIP and, who else was it? LNG, I think it was. Just after both of those other teams, I think, showed just a tad bit more than what OMG was showing. I still think they're all relatively in the same tier, in the same grouping, but OMG bouncing back with a nice win here is definitely a good thing. I think game number 1 was close for a bit, but OMG still very much felt like they had control of the game and of the series. Very good game from Aki in game number 1 on the Sejuani. I really like how Aki plays towards the beginning of the season. It always feels like he plays some of his best League of Legends as the season is starting, but of course, this team runs, lives, and breathes through its solo laners, Shanji and Cream, and Shanji also had a fantastic game number 1 on this K'Sante pick. Now, we're seeing K'Sante be a little bit hit or miss in some of these other regions, most notably the LEC, where its win rate isn't particularly good, but what we're seeing in other regions, regions like the LCS and in particular the LCK, is that K'Sante, when played at a high level and when played with, players who know how to play around it, is incredibly difficult to deal with. He can 1v1 basically anybody in the entire game, and he really doesn't have a lot of counters early on in laning phase. Your typical ones, the ones that you would think would do super well into him, things like the Gwen, just haven't really been working at a high level, and so I still like K'Sante. I still think he's an incredibly good pick. I know the win rate isn't particularly there, but I think he's a little bit more than what he's been able to show in some of the regions at a pro level right now. And so this is a good example, I think, of what K'Sante is actually able to do at a high level. Shanji was really good in game number 1, and so was Aki. Both of them were really, really solid. And then game number 2 was pretty much just a complete blowout. This was OMG from the beginning to the end. I should also note, this is the first series where PP actually got to play for OMG. Of course, he was signed right before the season started, so he actually had a little bit of a restriction on when he could join the team. He was able to join them here after Lunar New Year, and it worked out. We'll talk about the bot lane in a second. They weren't exactly the big power point, but they do go ahead and kind of force this Lucian Nami trade. I talk about this relatively frequently on the channel. I think trading Lucian Nami is almost always favorable for the team that gets Nami, so long as the bot lanes are relatively even. Luckily, in this case for OMG, their bot lane is just better. Abel's a better player than LPC. PP God is a much better player than Jin Zhao, and so trading that Lucian for the Nami ends up working out for OMG. They're able to have a lot of pressure early, even against the Caitlyn, which, quite frankly, just shouldn't happen, and so big credit to that bot lane. But player of the series for me is going to go to Cream in the mid lane, who just continues to impress me as a player. I think his mechanics are next level. I've talked about this on the channel before, but in my opinion, Cream he's a top 5 player in the LPL in terms of just mechanics, in terms of how he plays the game mechanically. Sometimes he makes some mistakes mentally, and he's not always the most versatile player in the world, but when he gets the champions he's good at, when he's able to play the game that he knows how to play and the style that he knows how to play, he is legitimately one of the best players in the LPL, and I think that definitely showed up in this series. He gets the Kassadin in game 1. I like the insurance draft in game number 1. You give over the Sivir Yuumi, and you know that eventually when you get to that late game, Maokai Sivir Yuumi is going to be a little bit of a problem. You don't want to go even towards the back half of that game. really LPC was the one keeping it close in game number 1, but you have your own insurance policy. Of course, you still have the Zeri for late game team fights, but the Kassadin is really the thing that I think is going to propel you over the top in those late game team fights, and that's kind of what happened there. Of course, the Sejuani and the Cassante helped out a lot in that vein as well. And then game number 2, it was just one super early. The Wukong was out on the map doing a lot of damage, and the Sylas was everywhere. I mean, this was an incredibly explosive performance from Cream. He just outplayed XQW at a high level. He was destroying him in the mid lane matchup. The Azir pick is usually really solid in lane right now against a lot of the other meta mid laners, but certainly not in this series. XQW got run over in his first series in the LPL. We'll get to him in a bit, but big credit to Cream. I thought he played really well. Also, credit Shanji, credit Aki. I think they were the two other players that I really want to point out on OMG playing really solid. And then Abel and PP God were also good. I think they weren't necessarily the big focal point. They did win lane in game number 2, but in game number 1, not exactly the best, like, lane dominant performance, right? Going into Sivir as Zeri, sometimes you're just going to get shoved in. It's going to happen, right? But overall, I think OMG looked so much better than their first series of the year that I'm willing to give it a pass. As for LGD, on the other hand, not really a great series. This team is still ranked last in my power rankings for a reason. I just don't really see a lot of upside for the roster in general. XQW is coming in for Haichao. I think that's fine. I like XQW more as a prospect, but he was awful in this series. Got to play Aurelia in game number 1, and while he had some moments playing with that Maokai in the jungle, it never really solidified, especially towards the back half of that game, and then really it was game 2 where he just got completely run over on the Azir, so he's going to get my dud of the series here, unfortunately, in his first series for LGD. I talked about this, I believe, in the first or second week for the LPL, where I feel bad giving dud of the series to someone in their first series, but for XQW, it really didn't feel like there was any other option. The only player on the team that I really want to shout out for LGD is going to be LPC. I still think he does have some problems in terms of positioning and in terms of actual impact on the game, especially towards the back half, very similar to the problems that he had on JDG at the beginning of last year, but I do think that he is someone who they clearly want to put their eggs in the basket of, because it's not Xiaoshu, it's not Meteor, who I really thought it was going to be. I thought Meteor was going to be the driving force, but it really does seem like they want to play through bot lane, which is certainly an interesting decision. I just hope that they figure out what they want to do and kind of move towards any direction, because outlook-wise for LGD, they're just not all that good right now. They kept pace a bit in game number 1 because of the draft, but game number 2, it really showed how overmatched they were in this series. And so for LGD, really what you're just hoping if you're a fan of them is that they're not going to be the worst team in the league. I don't really see this team fighting for top 10, fighting for playoffs or anything like that. They just need to get some development out of some of their younger players like XQW, players like Xiaoshu. You really hope in the top lane can be able to develop. That's what you're really looking for, I think, over the course of 2023, rather than any sort of immediate success. As for OMG, I think it's the opposite. You've been biding your time. You've been building this roster for so long. It is time to cash in, and I do think this could absolutely be the year. Now, obviously, I still need to see them against a better team than LGD. This isn't exactly the most dominant of teams to beat early on in the season, but a win's a win, and especially looking this good in game number 2, it does fill me with a bit of confidence. Shanji, Aki, Cream, Abel, PP got a very scary lineup. If they can click all on the same page, this team is actually going to be very, very good in the LPL, in my opinion. Moving on to our second series here of day number 1. We certainly had another interesting one as we saw Rare Adam taking on Ninjas in Pyjamas, and Rare Adam picks up a pretty surprising 2-0 series win here. I don't think a lot of people were going into the series with Rare Adam really being on the mind as a team that could compete with NIP, and honestly, you know, as much as I do like what Rare Adam was able to do on the Rift in this game, I certainly think that there were a lot of mistakes made by this team in draft, and NIP really was not able to capitalize on them at all. It's honestly more concerning for me that NIP was so bad in this series rather than Rare Adam being so good, but we'll get into that in a bit. Game number 1 and game number 2 were actually pretty similar. One was just a little bit closer than the other. Game 1 was relatively back and forth, but some small mistakes made by NIP towards the back half of the game, most notably Rich just not really being in the right spot on that Gnar. Really became a problem. Xiaolan Bao wasn't particularly good for the early game. Leon did a really good job with his pathing. Game number 2 was a little bit more of an easily identifiable version of what game number 1's problems were. Strive does a fantastic job in the mid lane to just completely outplay Dream, and Dream is quite frankly just in all the wrong places, especially towards the end of that game. I actually think NIP is actually in a spot to be able to maybe win if Dream on the Renekton is not just completely running it half the game, but here we are. Strive is going to get my player of the series here for Rare Adam. I thought he was fantastic here. Honestly, just way outplayed his opposing mid laner. I don't think he was the only option, but I think he was the one that definitely benefited the most from the overall aggressiveness, I would say, that NIP was going for. He kind of countered that aggressiveness, was able to do a lot of really cool plays, especially in the mid-game of game number 2, where we've seen that Sylas really start to get ahead in a lot of these LPL games. In particular, this region has always been incredible at playing Sylas as a champion, and I think he actively piloted it at a high level here in game number 2. So Strive for me is going to get my player of the series. He's someone who's continued to grow a lot over the past year, and I'm really glad to see that is continuing in 2023. I think Leon was also really solid here. We kind of know what he is at this point. He's a jungler that from ahead looks really good, from behind maybe not so much. He got ahead in both of these games. Honestly, he was just straight up better than Zhao Bao in this series, especially pathing-wise. Now, he wasn't perfect in a lot of these teamfights, but he did what was absolutely needed in a lot of them, which is, get onto this Sivir. I think that was really the important part. That was his job as the Vi. I talk about this Vi pick a lot. The LPL makes Vi work more so than a lot of other regions because of their incredibly aggressive playstyle. You can follow up a lot. You have a lot of teammates that are following up with Vi rather than her going in and kind of waiting for her to get all her shit off and then die before the rest of the team actually tries to respond like they do in some other regions. But in the LPL, you see a lot of really aggressive plays to follow up with that Vi, and I think it worked in this game. We saw Leon, ulting Photic here. He had the spell shield. He relied a lot on the spell shield, but it's pretty easy to break spell shield so long as the Vi has smite up. If you can smite the spell shield away, then you can land the ultimate, and then the Sivir is basically dead to rights if you have the Sylas or the Varus or the Gwen, anybody really following up in that game number 2. It was pretty problematic for Photic, who was all of NIP's damage, especially towards the back half of that game. So big shout out to Leon and Strive. I thought they were the two best players on Rear Adam, but also shout out to Cube, who I think dominated both of the players that he played against in the series in the top lane. He just looked better than both Rich and Invincible, both in lane and out of lane. So another very impressive performance from him. I think this top side's really good for Rare Adam. Obviously, a lot of people are making fun of the Leona pick in game number 1. I kind of agree. I don't know why you're picking Leona, let alone in this meta, but into Sylas, of all things, I feel like that is just such a bold pick, a very aggressive, risky pick, but it is Southwind. He plays like 4 champions at a high level. I didn't know Heimerdinger was one of them, but he was okay on the Heimer. I understand Southwind feels very particular about the champions that he wants to play. He didn't necessarily want to pick the Thresh, I guess, in this series, because that's really what I know him for. But Southwind on these engage-oriented, almost hook-style champions, things that can go in and really engage for the team. I think that's really his play style. Leona makes a lot of sense for that. Leona, Thresh are the 2 big picks that come to mind, but even something like the Blitzcrank and the Nautilus come to mind as well. And so for Southwind, I'm not particularly surprised to see the Leona. I just don't think it's all that good. So, decent win for Rare Adam, but for the most part, this is NIP just making a lot of mistakes. Strive did a really good job in particular to capitalize on those mistakes. I thought Leon made some really good plays, even if he was a little bit over-aggressive at some points in the series, but NIP really had nobody on the team that I felt super confident in. Photic and Zhuo were the closest that you were going to get to that over the course of these games, but even in that sense, they were outplayed towards the back half of this in a considerable margin. Photic holding on to all of his summoners as he just gets killed by Leon in game number 1, basically loses his team the game on the spot. Definitely not the play that you want to see out of your so-called best player, your hyper carry. Definitely you don't want to see him doing that, but it still boggles the mind that this team chose Zhuo over PP God. Now, obviously I'm not privy to internal information. I can just go off of the rumors, but if rumors are to be believed, this team actively chose to not re-sign PP God so that they could bring in Zhuo. I don't think that is working out so far. This team definitely looks a little bit indecisive. And I'm really not expecting that to change all that much as the series and the year continues onwards. But really, it was the mechanical play of a lot of their top side that really worried me in this game. Dream, someone who we've been really high on over the past year, he filled in for Rookie really nicely on that team last year, was horrendously bad in this series. He's an easy choice for Dead of the Series, easily the worst player, in my opinion, across these 2 games. That Renekton game in particular in game 2 was reportable, like genuinely reportable, just not good at all in any stretch, and so very easy choice for him to get Dead of the Series. He's going to need to prove that he can be a full-time starter in the LPL. I know we had a lot of high expectations for someone like him because of the small sample size, but there's a worse team around him this year than there was last year. Can he keep up, and can he, continue to be that big focal point like he was early on in spring last year? Zhao Bao has certainly taken some steps back. I already wasn't super high on him last year as a jungler. I thought he was way too carry-oriented for a team that really wanted to play through bot lane. It was almost necessary for them to play through bot lane in order to get Photic ahead for him to be able to do the things that he does in the back half of the game. He's definitely someone who likes to play with the lead, but Zhao Bao didn't necessarily do that a lot last year, and he's not doing it right now. He got outpathed by Leon in the early game, and really set Nip behind hard through the first couple of games here. And then Rich, Invincible, whoever it's going to be in the top lane just needs to be a little bit more stable. Both lost lane and both are bad in team fights. There's really no other way to put it. They're supposed to be the opposites there, where Rich is supposed to be a lot worse in lane, but significantly better in team fights, and Invincible is supposed to be more stable in lane, but isn't necessarily the same kind of macro team fight presence. Neither were good at either, and so you just got to figure out somebody to be able to play. I got a lot of comments on my LPL Power Rankings video that Invincible was not going to be the starter. I think we're going to be proving over the course of the year that that is not the case. It is Invincible's job to lose. That is really what I'm learning for NIP right now. Whether or not that's the right decision, that seems to be the one that they are going with. And so overall for NIP, you definitely need to find something. A lot of the players that were hyped up by a lot of people going into the year aren't performing, and I hate to say it, but I predicted that a tad bit. I was really worried about this team losing Rookie, about losing their identity, and I think that's kind of come to fruition here. PP God, I think, leaving is also a major problem, in my opinion. Easily the two best players on that Victory 5 team last year, and I think that's really starting to show. Dream and Juo are just not the replacements that you need in terms of cohesion early on in the season. Now, both of them are talented, most specifically Dream, and I think they can get it back on track. I just don't know if it's going to be soon. I'm still very worried about this NIP team, and I think there is a real possibility that they might not be a top 10 team. For Rare Adam, this is a good win. I don't know how sold I am on them. They are making a lot of mistakes in the mid game in particular, and in draft, obviously, but Strive and Leon played really, really well in this series, and if they continue to play like that, if Strive can step up and be one of the more influential mid laners in like this upper, lower tier of the LPL, you know, your 7 to 13 region, if he's going to be one of the more impactful mid laners that any of those teams have, usually that means success, but this might have been a little bit of an outlier. I'm just hoping Strive can continue to grow. He's the player who I like the most. I think Cube's incredibly solid. Leon, when he wins, is incredibly solid. The bot lane's going to be fine. I just don't know if Rare Adam necessarily has the upside to be like one of the best teams in the league or anything like that. Moving on to day number 2 now, and day number 2 was kicked off with a matchup between two teams that I think are actually really close in terms of skill level. Maybe not so much after this series, though. We saw ThunderTalk Gaming take on Team WE, and Team WE with a really strong victory here. Now, I had them ranked 11 and 12 in my power rankings going into this week. I thought both teams were right on that cusp of trying to compete for a playoff spot, at least on paper in terms of talent. But man, WE just completely outclassed ThunderTalk. This team looks kind of incompetent at the moment, and WE, on the other hand, looks like a team that can genuinely hang with a lot of these other teams that are fighting for playoff spots right now. Game number 1 was definitely the more stompy of the two. Game number 2 definitely had some heroics coming out from UCal, but for the most part, WE just kind of had full control of this series in almost every lane. I would say top lane was a little boring, and that's really the only lane where I would say there wasn't a lot of action. There really wasn't a lot of movement one way or the other, but every other lane, I would say jungle, mid, bot, all going in favor of WE in this series, and that's definitely very influential for a WE team that was really hoping they weren't going to be just a top-heavy team with some good players that were kind of carrying some worse ones. I think they proved in this series that a lot of the players on this team have really stepped up over the past few weeks, and hopefully they can continue to do so. Player of the series was a very easy choice for me in this one. It's going to go to Shanks. An unbelievable series from him. Obviously, he's shown some flashes of being dominant in the LPL before. It's just been flashes. He's never, really kept it up for any prolonged period of time, but in this series, I actually thought he was pretty fantastic. He did a really good job on that Akali in game number 1. A big shout out to Hang. I'll get to him in a second. I thought he was fantastic, but great job setting up Shanks in a lot of these fights with Maokai ult so that the Akali can go in and pretty freely get a kill early on in a lot of these fights, and then potentially, try and get back onto the rest at a 4v5 at that point. Really good cohesion there, I would say, generally speaking, between Hang and Shanks, but it was the game number 2 that impressed me as well here on the Azir, where UCal was playing pretty fantastic on the Jace. He actually had a small lead. Big credit to UCal. We'll talk about him. He was the shining light of ThunderTalk over the course of these 2 games, but for Shanks on that Azir, that late game damage that Azir we know he can put out was really, really high in that second game. He was a big reason why they were able to win it in the end. He did a really good job holding UCal at bay in terms of spacing, in terms of damage, and then being able to output just as much, if not more than anything that this ThunderTalk Gaming team was actually able to do in that game number 2. And so Shanks, very easy choice for my player of the series here. Hang was actually really close to this for me. He was really good in this series, although I'm not going to say it's just because of this, but his opposing jungler was awful. I think he made all of the wrong choices in this series, so Hang had a much easier job, I think, than normal. I know a lot of people are really high on him as a jungler that is kind of up and coming, potentially the next, big name young jungler in the LPL. I haven't necessarily seen him do it yet. I think this series is the best that he's looked in the LPL up until this point through their first 3 series of the year, but I still think I really want to see him against some of the top talent in the league. I'm not necessarily sold that he is going to be this unbelievable player from day one, kind of like a You Should Know Me has been for Invictus Gaming so far. He's been good, but he hasn't been that level of good. I think this was a very good performance, most specifically the Maokai game in game number 1, where it felt like he was just constantly setting Shanks up for these perfect engages. They were on the exact same page every single time. I think those two, if they can continue to work together as well as they are right now, I think that is only going to be positive. I think I remember the Beishong Shanks kind of duo from WE in 2021. This does remind me a bit of that, where it felt like those two players were just kind of clicking on the right cylinders all year long, and it was helping the team out a lot. I think it's very similar for them right now. Hopefully that can continue against some better teams, though. And then Hope and Awandi complete rocks in the bottom lane. Their scorelines look fantastic. I don't think they necessarily were big carries in this game, but what they did was just be better than Huanfeng and Jinlu in lane. They were up, most of these games. They definitely were up in pressure, but they were really solid in team fights as well. They knew they necessarily didn't have to be the carries because Shanks was super fed and Hang was doing a good job of setting him up, and so they just knew they had to be solid in the bot lane. They didn't have to over push or overwork anything, and they did that. They were really, really solid, and they came out of the game with a win because of it. They let their mid laner win the game, and I think there are a lot of bot lanes, not only in the LPL, but across the world, that could learn a lot from that. Knowing when you need to do too much, and knowing when you don't need to do too much in order for you to win the game. So, good cohesion overall from WE. This felt like a much more team-oriented win than I think this organization has experienced in a long time. Then you've also got TT on the other side. Yikes. I mean, I'm not going to hit the panic button, but you're 0-4. This is a team that was really killing it in the preseason. I got a lot of comments, and I mean a lot of comments. This was probably the most talked about thing in my preseason power rankings, that I was underrating this ThunderTalk team, that me putting them outside of the top 10 was pretty ludicrous. I don't know. I feel pretty confident about that right now, that this team just isn't on paper what we thought they were going to be. I was worried about this top side. I was worried about Hoya and Beishuan being able to hold up with a lot of other people. I didn't think Jinlu was a great addition to the team. I thought a player like Yao Yao was going to be better than him. And I wasn't sold on Yucal, which might be wrong. He was actually really good in this series. His game 1 was fine. Honestly, he was just outplayed in game number 1 by Shanks. But game number 2, he kept up. I mean, you can make a real case he was the best performing member in game number 2, if only for the fact that he was playing 1v9 on that Jace, trying his absolute best to win the game. But it's the rest of the team that just couldn't hold up. I was really high on Huanfeng going into the year. I thought he was actually going to push this team a little bit higher than people were expecting, but he was not good at all in this series. He was pretty good towards the start of the year in their first series. I'm not going to hit the panic button on him just yet, but, we've seen good AD carries go to bad teams and not be able to perform. Like, Elk last year is definitely someone that comes to mind. I'm not going to say Huanfeng is washed, but it's kind of hard to play AD carry if the rest of your team sucks, and that kind of feels like what's happening with ThunderTalk right now. But dud of the series was a really easy choice. It's going to go to Beishuan. This is second time, 2 series in a row. They've played 2 series now. That's 2 dud of the series for Beishuan. He's been really bad to kick off the year. This is someone who has shown flashes at the LPL level in the past of being a good player, but it just isn't there right now. I know that there are a lot of people that have been out on Beishuan for a long time. I wasn't necessarily one of them. I actually still thought he had a decent amount of upside. He just needed to get rid of a lot of the mistakes that he was making, and it just doesn't feel like that's happening. It feels like as the team kind of devolves around him, he is getting worse and worse and worse, and he has clearly been the worst player on this TT team through the first couple of games, and that's problematic. They have a really big superstar 18-year-old jungler down there in the LDL. I wouldn't be surprised if we see him sooner rather than later on the main roster, but for Beishuan, if he is going to keep playing, he just has to get better. These aren't particularly difficult to execute comps, especially in game number 2, where all you have to do is peel for the Jace. You just have to make sure Jason Zeri can win you the game. That really is all that you have to do, and even then, it was kind of difficult for Beishuan to do that in that one. And so, for ThunderTalk, I am starting to get a little bit concerned. I'm not going to hit the panic button and say they're like the worst team in the league, sitting at 0-4 or anything like that, but they need to pick up some wins because right now they just don't look like a team that is clicking at all. They could very much be the Ultra Prime of 2023. And then for WE, this looks solid. I don't necessarily think they're a playoff team just because they beat ThunderTalk. I didn't have ThunderTalk as a playoff team, but they are very consistent. And I think there is something to absolutely be said for that in the regular season of the LPL. You need to be able to beat up on these teams that are right outside of the playoffs. Even a lot of other teams that are, inside the playoffs right now. A team like Ninjas and Pyjamas that we just talked about isn't a team that I feel confident is going to be consistent enough to beat a lot of these teams, as we saw with the Rare Atom series. And so WE might actually find their way sneaking into the playoffs. And after what happened in 2022, that would be a pretty big miracle for this organization. Moving on to our second series here of day number 2, we had an interesting one between two bottom teams, at least that's what I'm projecting. We had Anyone's Legend taking on Ultra Prime, and Ultra Prime actually does pick up the 2-1 series win. Anyone's Legend is in complete disaster mode right now, certainly not looking good. I don't really know what to say about AL. We'll get to them in a bit. Game number 1 was actually theirs. They actually do a really good job of playing off of this Jax in the side lane. I actually think they have a lot of pressure up on top side, which allows Betty to play really aggressive on this Zeri in a lot of these, 3v3, 4v4 little skirmishes, because they know that Jax is going to be able to do a lot in this side lane. The Renekton's not going to be able to match. Sejuani is certainly not going to be able to match. They really don't have anybody on the enemy team that's going to be able to match on the side of AL, so they're actually able to translate a lot of that map pressure and map power into general team fight success, and they actually do that really well. A really good game from AL in game 1. I was like, oh, okay, maybe they're not the worst team in the league like they have looked over the first couple of series, but that all fell away very fast in games 2 and 3. Game 2, Zeri. Game 3, Zeri. It just kind of happened very, very quickly. Now, I've talked about this. I think Lucian is stronger than Zeri right now. However, the data has suggested that Zeri is doing a much better job in recent weeks of being able to beat Lucian. It was incredibly lopsided to start the year, especially in the LPL through the first 2 weeks, but ever since, I would say like a week or 2 ago in all of these regions, Zeri has kind of fought her way back up the win rate chart against Lucian, and so maybe it's a lot more even or even Zeri favored than I originally anticipated. Maybe people are getting more used to the matchup, which seems weird to me because this is the same matchup you were playing all of last year. How are you not used to it already? But yeah, I don't know. Zeri's doing a lot better right now, and Zeri was the big power pick in this series, so much so that Doggo is just going to get my player of the series. Now, I'm not going to just sit here and say that Zeri was the only reason Doggo looked good. He actually played really well in this series. His positioning, his ability to kite out a lot of these engages on the side of AL, especially early game where I think they wanted to exert a lot of pressure on that Elise in game number 2. I think he did a really good job of being able to make sure that he wasn't in a position where he could actually be taken advantage of in that way. I was really, really impressed with Doggo's performance. This is probably the best that he has looked basically just by himself in the LPL. I really wasn't all that impressed with him last year in terms of his mechanics. He had some games where he looked solid, but it really looked like the rest of his team were kind of pushing him forward. He looked better because of the talent around him, and then when he looked bad, it looked like he looked bad because he wasn't as good as the talent around him. This was one of the first games in the LPL where it really felt like Doggo was holding his own against another LPL team, which I think is a good sign, but it's an even worse sign for AL because that is not good at all. I thought Baolan was a lot better in this series than he had been towards the beginning half of the year. And then honestly, let's talk about the mid lane matchup. I was actually really excited to see this mid lane matchup. It's going to be Ching versus Pins. Obviously, two former FPX Blaze mid laners, one replacing the other. Pins getting replaced in that matchup, and Pins making his LPL debut for Anyone's Legend here. And I was actually really interested to see how that would play out. Mid lane has been kind of a black hole position for AL over the course of the beginning part of the season, and Pins was a lot better, but honestly, the mid lane matchup didn't really matter. It was all about the bot lane. Doggo and Baolan, being able to step up in games 2 and 3 were really the difference maker between this team winning and losing, in my opinion. Shout out to Ning, shout out to Harry. They were fine. Harry maybe not so much in game number 1, but they were fine. Just, it was really all about the bot lane for Ultra Prime. As for AL, yikes, this is not good. I think you really have one player trying to make plays and a bunch of others that are just kind of sitting there and rolling over and dying. This honestly seems familiar with a lot of the other bottom teams across the world, teams that underperform, is you have one player that actually feels like they're trying to win the game, and the rest that just aren't on the same page. Credit to Betty, I thought he tried in game number 1 when he was on the Zeri, but as soon as he lost that Zeri pick, when he got on the Lucian, when he got on the Sivir, he was really bad in games 2 and 3, and that's definitely frustrating to say. This is a player that has struggled with consistency in the LPL in the past, and I definitely think that bleeds over. ZDZ was really good in game number 1 on the Jax, like I said, was creating a lot of pressure. Tried tried his best in games 2 and 3, but for the most part just wasn't all that influential. It's kind of hard to be influential on Jason Jax when your team is losing. And then I actually liked Xiao Hao's performance. I know his scoreline doesn't exactly say it, but I thought he was the one who, in my opinion, was at least trying to make plays on AL through these losses. He was attempting to go in and attempting to do things, and I always give credit to players who do that. A lot of people who watch my channel will know I would much rather see you go down swinging than just roll over and die, at least in terms of an analysis standpoint. Xiao Hao was trying to go down swinging, the rest of the team not so much, but dud of the series, pretty easy choice for me. It's going to go to Sword Art, and I know, 2 games of Yuumi, how can I give him dud of the series? He just has so little impact on the game, and that's kind of translated through their first 3 series just in general here for AL, where Sword Art just has so little impact on what actually happens in these games that it almost feels like he's not even there. This player, you know, we talked about him, oh, is he over the hump, is he not over the hump? He was, you know, kind of good, kind of bad in his last couple performances. You know, I wanted to see what he was going to do that, and he was back in a full-time starting role. Oops, he's really bad. Like, that really is kind of where we're at. Sword Art has been replacement level over the course of the first couple of games, and so hopefully he can get his form, either that or hopefully Chocho is still on call for AL, because this support position has been a little bit of a problem for this team. If it continues up, I don't really see a world in which they can get up beyond, you know, the bottom 3-ish teams in the LPL right now. So for AL, this team is bad. Like, there really is nothing else to say. The bot lane is bad. The mid lane really didn't offer anything inspiring, at least in this series, against another mid laner that, quite frankly, you should just be able to beat here. I was excited for Pins to come in, but not a great debut series. Even if I do like ZDZ and Xiao Hao, and I do think that they're playing okay here for AL, at least better than the rest of the team, I don't think it particularly matters, because there's really only so much you can do when your bot lane is losing in this meta in particular. But for Ultra Prime, really good series win. A lot of the players that I had some question marks on looked good, most specifically the bot lane here in Doggo and Bao Lam. Now, of course, they're going against poor competition. I always say this, I want to see them actually look good against a good team before I consider them a team that even has a chance of sniffing playoffs, because I still think on paper this team very much worries me. But this is a solid win for an Ultra Prime team that desperately needed one, and hopefully they can walk away from this with at least a slightly more confidence than what they had going into it. That means we can jump into day number 3 now, and day number 3 kicked off with a series between 2 undefeated teams leading into this. We had Invictus Gaming taking on Edward Gaming, and IG keeps the ball rolling. I'm so excited for this team. This team I had ranked dead last in my preseason power rankings. I could not have been more wrong about what we were going to get out of them. Now, obviously, there have been some major developments from this roster going into 2023. This is not the same organization that was in 2022, Invictus Gaming. This is not the same team at all. On and Wink are just completely different players. I think the meta is helping them out a ton. Wink gets to just play Varus and Misfortune in the support role. Obviously, former AD carry, longtime AD carry in the LPL for a lot of teams, and you get to see On kind of play off of that really well. You get to see a player like You Should Know Me in the top lane who is legitimately an MVP candidate right now in the LPL. Basically, everything is working out. And honestly, with all of those pieces that we've kind of talked about over the course of the season, I feel like the 2 imports are kind of lost in the shuffle here with Gideon and Dove, but both of them played spectacularly in this series in particular. Gideon is actually going to get my player of the series for Invictus against EDG here. He so thoroughly outclassed JJ in the jungle. I think it was the biggest outclassing from one side to the other in this series. And let me tell you, IG winning both of these games, they won them both pretty dominantly. Like, they were the better team by a consistent margin, but Gideon was the one who looked the most in control of anybody on Invictus, and that really does surprise me. I did actually have some hope for Gideon going into the season. You can go back and check my power rankings video for that. Gideon was kind of the player on this team that I was by far the most excited about, because I didn't know You Should Know Me wasn't an import. Again, thanks to Wikipedia for kind of screwing that one up. But Gideon was actually someone who I was really kind of interested in seeing moving forward, and he thoroughly outclassed JJ in this series. Now, JJ isn't exactly the pinnacle of consistency. We talked about that a lot last year when we talked about EDG's struggles over the course of the middle part of summer. But to see Gideon come out and just look so solid in this series, I think is honestly quite surprising to me. I think if he continues at this pace, if he's going to be like a top 7, 8-ish jungler in the LPL, like, this team is going to keep up. This team is going to be one of the top teams in the region, because we know that On and Wink are right in their wheelhouse when it comes to the meta that's currently in right now. You Should Know Me is legitimately an MVP candidate, and Dove has actually been playing really solid. If Gideon can be like a jungler that can control the game more so than even some of the top teams junglers, that is going to be absolutely huge for Invictus. So Gideon having such a good series, super inspiring. You Should Know Me again was pretty great. He made some crucial mistakes towards the beginning part of a lot of these games. However, he still was incredibly impactful towards the back half of these games, especially on that Jackson game number 1, where it's just like, ah, man, he really is a good player, isn't he? He just is a player that knows how to play from ahead. He knows how to play from behind. We'll talk about that with Ale in a second, but Ale was given so many chances to do well in this series, and he took advantage of none of them. And so, good for You Should Know Me, another good series from him. And then Dove. I mean, what an absolute Chad Dove is right now. When he gets to play on a team where the rest of the team is kind of clicking, he's back in his native mid lane position. I mean, he just becomes incredibly aggressive, and that's kind of what we saw out of him in this series. An incredibly fun teleport coming out of him in one of these games, and honestly, you just got to give a lot of credit to this top side. I really wasn't sure how they were going to click, but they have clicked incredibly well, and also credit to the bot lane. It's right up their wheelhouse when it comes to meta right now. I am a little bit worried about what happens once this stops being meta, but Wink honestly has looked pretty good even on Enchanters over the beginning part of this season. I'm not saying that's going to last the entirety of the year, but right now you can play 280 carries in the bot lane, and that means you can pick Varus, you can pick MF support because they have one CC ability, and it kind of ends up working out. Umbral Glaive is a really funny item, huh? So IG, really, really looking good right now, hoping that it lasts. As for EDG, kind of a bad showing here. I'm getting a little concerned. They looked really good to kick off the year. Obviously, I was more interested and concerned with how players like Fofo and how players like Leave would be able to gel on this EDG team at the beginning of the year. But right now, the concern for me in this series was the top side. It was just bad. JJ, like I said, got jungled circles around. I was very much considering him for dud of the series. He only participated in 4 kills across the entire series. That is the lowest of anybody on the team, which is never good if you're the jungler. But it was really hard for me not to give dud of the series here to Ale in the top lane, who felt like he was given so much. You Should Know Me with a very ill-advised invade early on in that first game that Ale was able to take advantage of, and then from that point onwards, Ale just lost. Like, he just took his lead and threw it over and over again, and that's even more disappointing for me than JJ, who just wasn't good at any point of the game. And so, Ale's gonna get dud of the series for me. It could absolutely go to JJ. These two players need to step up. Both of them are, quite frankly, notoriously inconsistent. Ale had a very bad 2022. We talked about it on LNG just kind of being a cohesion problem. Obviously, a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes. He ends up getting benched for a player that is significantly worse than him. He comes back in to play for playoffs, and they honestly play really well once he's back in, so I had faith that he kind of turned it around. Maybe getting out of the organization was going to be good for him, but he was not good in this series at all. And I know he's going up against a very good top laner, but still, you got to do better than what you did here. And then JJ, he got benched last year for a reason. I'm not going to compare him to a player like Pioshik, but honestly, I think they are closer than people give them credit for. I know JJ doesn't necessarily get the same kind of reputation, but he is a carry-oriented jungler that isn't particularly good at playing towards anything that isn't mid lane, and we kind of see that right now, where Fofo is getting a lot of the resources for EDG, and I just don't know if that's the right call. I don't know if Fofo's the player I want to be putting all my eggs in the basket of. Even a player like Leave, who is a rookie at this level, I would trust a little bit more than a player like Fofo, who's had a bad last few years, and for him to have literally negative pressure on the map at any point in any of these two games, it's very disappointing against another young jungler in Gideon, and so those two players just simply have to be better. But for EDG as a whole, I'm not going to completely throw them out the window yet. IG is just rolling right now. This is a team that feels like they can't be stopped by basically anybody. So for them to be able to take a series against EDG, I don't think it's the worst thing in the world, but we're seeing a lot of these upper mid-tier teams like EDG, teams like RNG, not be able to consistently win against some teams that are lower than them in my power rankings. This is very typical of the LPL, but it is worth noting that consistency and being able to beat these lower teams is what usually separates a lot of the top teams in the region from a lot of the teams that are okay in the region. Just look at 2022 in terms of, you know, how that top 4 quote-unquote separated themselves, but Victory 5 really couldn't hang because they couldn't keep up inconsistency with a lot of the other teams. I think, not saying that EDG and RNG are going to kind of be that this year, but it definitely is going to kind of raise some question marks for me after this series. But for IG, just keep it rolling. Everything is clicking right now. Every player is playing above expectations. As long as they can keep their confidence high and keep the ball rolling, I think this team could genuinely contend to be like a top 4 or 5 team in the LPL this year. Moving on to our second game here of day number 3. We had a matchup between two teams that I think are really fighting to solidify themselves and not really free fall too far from what they were last year. We have LNG Esports taking on Royal Never Give Up. And LNG picks up the victory here. RNG with another brutal loss. I mean, this team is in complete freefall mode here. A 2-0 series loss is exactly what they did not need at the moment. And, you know, as we'll see later in the week, I'll kind of talk about this towards the back half of the series, but they did end up making changes because of this series. So we'll get to RNG after. We always talk about the winners first. So let's talk about LNG here. They actually kick off their season 2-0, and that surprises me just a tad bit. I was worried that this team wouldn't exactly click early on into the season, mostly because I was worried about LP in the bot lane. I was worried that he wasn't going to be able to keep up with a lot of these other AD carries, but as it turns out, he is okay. I wouldn't say that he's great. He certainly has moments where he is a little bit overmatched in the bot lane, but for the most part, he's been able to keep up with a lot of these other good LPL bot laners, and I think that he should be fine. As long as the rest of the team is performing the way that they are right now, I imagine that he will continue to look fine, because the rest of the team really is clicking really, really well right now. My player of the series is going to go to Zika in the top lane. Really like the 2 games of Jax that he pulled out here in games 1 and game 2 here. I thought he was just better than Breathe. We'll get to that in a second, but a lot of pressure spent on topside from both teams, from Tarzan and from Wei, and I think Zika just came out on top in this matchup. Zika was just a little bit better today. I think top lane is very volatile. I'm not going to sit here and, you know, there are a lot of people on Reddit, and we'll get to this in a second, talking about Breathe, that overreact a lot to series like this where you see Zika just being better than Breathe in a couple of games, and you're like, Breathe is washed, he's not even a top 10 top laner in the region, and Zika's number 1, and etc, etc. I'm not exactly going to go that far. A big reason why I started this channel was because I felt like there was a lot of overreactions and overreacting to a couple of games in the League community, and I wanted to be a voice that was maybe a little bit different than that. I think I'm probably going to stick there for now. I think Zika is really, really solid. He's probably better than I was giving him credit for at the start of the year, but I think this RNG team has a lot of problems right now. I think in terms of cohesion, in terms of shot calling, they're just not on the same page, and I don't think that's necessarily one particular player's fault. I think Zika was just able to take a lot of advantage of that. Tarzan, to a good extent as well, was able to take a lot of advantage of that, but the other player that you have to talk about on the side of LNG here is going to be Scout in the mid lane. These are the players that you really needed to see step up. Obviously, Tarzan, Scout, Hang, they were the big 3 for LNG that we knew about going into the year. When you heard me talk about them in my preseason power rankings video, I said those 3 players I feel pretty confident are going to be solid. Obviously, Scout's been very good for a long time. Tarzan's been very good for a long time. Hang has been good for a slightly shorter amount of time, but still a long time. It was Zika and LP that really needed to step up, and so to see Tarzan and Scout looking good, to see Hang looking good is solid, but to see Zika getting player of the series, that's where it really starts to feel a lot better for me, I would say, as an LNG fan, or as someone that might be pushing for LNG. I think Zika looked really, really solid in this series. Again, I think everybody looked solid, especially the solo laners, but for the most part, it was a top lane battle, and that kind of brings us into RNG as well, where I agree, it was a top lane battle, and unfortunately, Breathe comes out on the wrong side of that, because he was given a lot of attention. There was a lot of jungle attention and just general pressure on the top side. I think top lane was actually really influential in this series, and Breathe just wasn't quite up to snuff. 2 games against a Jax, not necessarily what you want to see if you're Breathe, because I think Jax is just generally pretty OP right now. To leave that up in 2 games, I think was the wrong choice. And then clearly when the enemy team is going to go for these more skirmish-oriented tanks in the jungle, things like the Maokai, and of course the Sejuani as well, I think you're obviously inviting a lot of pressure on that top side when you pick things like the Renekton, when you pick things like the Graves, and unlike our previous series where it felt like the loser and Ale had a lot of pressure early on, I don't think Breathe had pressure at all in this series at any point. I think Wei suffered because of it, I think Breathe suffered because of it, and I definitely think the rest of the team suffered because of it. Let's talk about the mid lane here, because they actually swapped him out between games. I'm not exactly sure what RNG is doing here. They bring in Angel, who should just be the starter for RNG, but they're playing Tong Yuan as well in that mid lane spot. I wasn't super high on Tong Yuan going into the year. I thought he was fine for RNG's LDL team last year, but Angel should be significantly better as a player, at least from everything that I've seen from those 2 on tape, and you know, neither has really looked good to start the year, but it's hard to really blame them. It feels like the cohesion and the synergy on this team is just -0. Angel has had plenty of time to get used to playing on this team and with these players in scrims. So clearly they are seeing something that we are not. Clearly they're either seeing something good in Tong Yuan or more likely, in my opinion, they're seeing something bad in Angel that they don't particularly like, and they feel like they want to test out to see who the better mid laner is. I still think that should end up being Angel in the long run, but to see them be indecisive at that mid lane spot is certainly concerning, I would say, overall, especially when your top lane is playing so poorly like it is right now. And then the bot lane is going to continue to be a problem. I feel super bad for Gala. He's trying his absolute best to actually win games for this team. His positioning has been good. He's not playing too over-aggressive, but he is able to do damage in a lot of these fights. He just has maybe the worst support in the LPL right now in Bunny. Now, this is where I'm going to bring up the changes that this team ended up making, because this is where we start talking about the outlooks of these teams moving into the future weeks. For RNG in particular, obviously they have looked so poor over their first few weeks. They have had no Ming. He has continued to hold out, continued to be a free agent. After this series, they did bite the bullet. They paid him, they brought him back, or at least I assume they paid him, because they brought him back, right? Obviously, player salaries aren't public, so he is going to be playing for RNG from this point in the season onwards. That should be absolutely massive for them. Bunny has just straight up been bad, like not even just like not good, he's just been bad and active detriment to this team over their first 3 series. And so for Ming to come back in, hopefully that gives them some level of cohesion. Hopefully that gives them some level of shot calling, because right now it just feels like they have no idea where to be on the map. They were really just relying on their skill to carry them this far, but that doesn't solve all of the problems, because topside is still a little bit up in the air. I think Wei has just been bad to start the year as well. He has been incredibly underperforming, and Breathe had a really poor series here as well. Mid lane is still not figured out. It's really just been Gala, who I think has had decent performances to start the year. So RNG still with some major question marks, but you're kind of just hopefully optimistic that when Ming comes back in, they're going to be able to solve a lot of those question marks. And then for LNG, on the other hand, a good win. I mean, you're starting 2-0, 4-0. That's about as good of a start as you could possibly ask for. Hasn't exactly been to plan. I think it's 2 series that were kind of weird, but Zika looking really good in the top lane, LP looking solid in the bot lane, not necessarily someone that needs to show out, just someone that needs to not be a problem, and that's certainly what he has been over the first couple of games here, is not a problem, which is good. And then Tarzan and Scout are pretty much everything you could have asked for. They're working together really well, a lot better than Tarzan and Doenby at the beginning of last year for LNG, and so overall, actually cautiously optimistic about where this team's outlook is moving into the future. Obviously, I need to see them play a team that actually has cohesion at the top of the standings, because RNG just isn't that right now, but, you know, they're taking care of business against these teams that they probably should, and that's a good sign, I think, for things to come in the future. Moving on to day 4 now. We're getting close to that middle of the week here. Day 4 is kind of the break point in the middle. And we certainly had a good one to kick off our midweek matchup. We had Ninjas in Pyjamas taking on JD Gaming, and JDG just continues to look like the best team in the LPL without question. We knew that on paper this was a super team going into the year, arguably 4 of the top, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 best players in the world going into the year here on JDG, and then they showed up in week 1 and looked utterly dominant in their series win. And now we're back after Lunar New Year, and nothing has changed. This team continues to look unbelievably strong, and it's very, very fun to watch. For JDG, there's really not a lot of analysis to do, because all the players on the team really just are skill gapping everyone they're playing against, and it's kind of fun to watch in that sense, but there really hasn't been a lot of testing that this team has had to go through. It's just a lot of, oh, these players are better, so they look a lot better. The only real negative thing that I think they've had to overcome at all is the fact that Kanavi sometimes goes a little bit psycho when all of his lanes are winning. He's never really had a position where all of his lanes are winning in his career. So now with Knight and Ruler and 369 all playing in lanes for him, he's like, well, what do I do? They're all winning. I guess I'll just go ham and try to invade. And sometimes that's a little bit too much. He presses on the gas a little bit too quickly. Sometimes he was caught out for that a little bit in this series, but even then, like, for the most part, a lot of those plays are going to work out for JD Gaming, especially if Knight continues to play these more skirmish-oriented, almost shove and roam type of champions that he was super good on over the course of last year. Obviously, the Talia definitely fits that description, but Knight is going to be my player of the series here. I know some people are going to argue that. Some people are certainly going to look at the score lines and say that Ruler deserves it, or even someone like Missing deserves it. First of all, hard for me to give player of the series to someone who played 2 games of Yuumi. No offense, you can have Yuumi mechanics, right? But sometimes that champion just goes a little bit nutty. And then for Ruler, honestly, his damage output was just a little bit low for me. I thought his team fight impact was significantly lower than what Knight was actually offering in the mid lane. And so while Ruler was fantastic and he continues to be an MVP candidate in the LPL through the first couple of weeks, I thought Knight was just a tad bit more impactful in this series, especially on that Yone in game number 1, where he was just so fun to watch. Got to see Yone into Akali, always a fun matchup to kind of partake in, and man, did Knight just completely destroy the mid lane, and then he completely destroyed all the team fights. This is why I call Knight one of, if not the single most talented player in the entire world. Any given game, he can just straight up win the game for you, and that's kind of what happened in game number 1. He was also fantastic in game number 2 on the Taliyah here, where he worked with Kanavi really, really well to set up Ruler, but obviously, we have to talk about the 4v2 that Ruler underwent in the bot lane. Obviously, Ruler and missing on this Zeri Yuumi, something that has continued to rise in success rate as the season has gone on. I mean, what a dominant performance here in game number 2. A 4v2 coming out from Ruler and missing. You've seen the clip. If you're watching this video, I promise you that you have. If you haven't, go check it out. It's literally everywhere on Twitter, on Reddit. I mean, you can find it pretty easily on the internet right now. I'd be surprised if you hadn't seen it, but just an incredibly impressive display of mechanical skill coming out from the bot lane, and that's really what JDG just is at this point. They're a team that is so much better than the teams that they are going up against in the LPL right now that they can kind of just skill gap everybody. Knight is so much better than every other mid. Ruler and missing are so much better than every other bot lane, and even though played okay in the series. 369 is so much better than most of the other top laners, even though he had a rough start in their first series of the year. He was kind of almost lost them that series to begin the year. And Kanavi, while he makes some mistakes, it still looks pretty good overall for JDG. And so, really, I mean, are there any negatives to talk about with this team? They just look so good. As for NIP on the other side, this is their second loss of the week. They're now sitting at 1-2. I am getting a little concerned, although losing to JDG isn't exactly the worst thing in the world. Some of these players just aren't stepping up. They're not the kind of impact that they need them to be. Obviously, you can talk about Dream and Zhuo. We didn't really expect them to be able to hold their own against a team like JDG. That's not really where we expected their skill sets to be, but players like Invincible and Zhao and Bao just really are not at this level. You can kind of toss up who you want to give done to the series to out of the two of them. I'm going to give it to Invincible just because I feel like he was a little bit more useless in this series, although Zhao and Bao was actively hurting his team a lot in this series against Kanavi, where Kanavi would make a lot of these really aggressive plays, and some of them Zhao and Bao was able to push back on, but even some of them where Kanavi was incredibly overextended, Zhao and Bao was just so much worse than him in terms of positioning in the game that it didn't even matter, like he couldn't actually capitalize. So you want to give it to one, you want to give it to the other. Zhao and Bao was definitely worse in game number 1 on the Sejuani, but Invincible was definitely worse in my opinion in game number 2 on the Gwen, and so whatever you end up wanting to give it to there, I think it makes sense, but for me, it's going to go to Invincible. I know a lot of people are talking about how Rich is now elo held, but I do want to remind a lot of people that Rich isn't exactly a superstar up in the top lane. It's not, you know, unfathomable, you know what I'm talking about. It's not that word that Rich would be getting benched and that somebody else would be getting another look. Like, it's not completely out of the realm of possibility for a team to be like, we want to see if we can do better than Rich, right? It's just Invincible is not it. Invincible is not better than Rich. I also think that Rich having a little bit of an argument with management over the course of the offseason, not really wanting to return to this team, has certainly impacted his playing time at the beginning of the year. It remains to be seen if that will continue throughout the rest of the split, but for now, it seems like it is Invincible's job to lose, even if he is going to play poorly. And if Zhao and Bao continues to play poorly, you're going to wonder why this team ever decided to fully commit to him instead of some of the other options that they had available to them in the jungle. Right now, it just seems like it's Fodic kind of performing okay. Even then, I still think he got heavily outplayed by Ruler in this series, and his positioning certainly wasn't perfect over the second half of the game, even if he was doing a lot of damage in game number 2 on the Lucian. That's just kind of what Lucian does, is a lot of damage. I don't necessarily think it was Fodic playing ridiculously out of his mind, but I mean, that is all of that to say that Fodic is by far the best player on this team right now. So Nip is just really struggling. This looks like a team that might actually be in danger of missing the playoffs. I'm not necessarily going to go that far just yet. It'll be interesting to see how the rest of the week plays out, but with a bunch of teams overperforming, teams like WE, teams like Invictus Gaming, teams like Rare Atom earlier in the week, Nip really has to figure some shit out before they really start to, you know, convince me that they are definitely a team that deserves to be in the top 10 no matter what. And then for JDG, I mean, this team's number 1. Like, no question. Knight looks unbelievable. Ruler looks unbelievable. Missing looks unbelievable. 369 and Kanavi definitely have their ups and downs, but for the most part, this team just looks genuinely unstoppable at the moment, and that is about as good as you could ask for from this JDG team. Hopefully, they only get better as the year goes on, because if this team is, like, as good as they could possibly be, this is a top of the world, like, win MSI, win Worlds type of team with really not a lot of exceptions. Moving on to our second series here of day number 4, we had another top team actually thrown into some action here, as we saw literally Top Esports take on Rare Atom. And Top Esports gets the job done. I know Rare Atom's been overperforming some expectations, but I don't think a lot of people saw them going against Top Esports and picking up a win here. So nothing really too surprising. Really the only surprising thing, first of all, Xingtian's still in there as the starting top laner over Wayward. It looks like he is going to be the starter for the year for Top Esports, and I think if he plays like he played in this series all year, it's going to be good. Obviously, some inconsistency coming out of him from the beginning of the year. Wasn't super hot in him in their first couple of series of the year, but this one was fantastic. Most specifically, that Darius game number 2, where he was just incredible. A really good series from him overall, but Top Esports really just kind of clicking right now. Obviously, there are some holes that you could poke into a couple of their moves. I think Tian at multiple points in this series felt like he was kind of running it just a tad bit, but Top Esports still able to overcome a lot of those problems and pick up a pretty clean 2-0 win here. Player of the series, I already talked about it a bit. Gotta go to Xingtian here in the top lane. Very impressive performance. A really good game number 1, but I mean, it's game number 2 that people are going to remember. The 3v1 in the top lane on the Darius. That's what people are going to remember. You see that Jace come out in draft and you're like, oh, they must be going into the top lane. So RA goes for the Camille. They go for something that can try and punish the Jace just a tad bit more than normal. Psych, Rookie's the best Jace in the LPL, maybe. I mean, there were a lot of good Jace players, but Rookie is right up there with them, and Xingtian goes for something that can really punish the Camille pick with the Darius early, and it works out. Absolutely dominant play from TES. If he continues to play like this throughout the rest of the year, I mean, they are going to be the team we all thought they were in that S tier, right alongside JD Gaming. Obviously, it wasn't exactly the perfect start to the year. They looked good. They lost against a good Weibo team. So I'm not going to be overly critical of their inability to take both of their first 2 series, but they really do look solid here. I think, obviously, we've already talked about the top lane, but you got to shout out Rookie as well. Probably the most consistent player on this team, maybe the most consistent player in the entire league. I mean, this dude has just been on roster after roster where it's like, oh, there's some question marks in one position or another, and then at the end of the day, it ends up working out because Rookie is just really, really good every single year. That looks like it's going to continue here. He absolutely brutalized Strive in the mid lane. I'm not going to cut that out. That was kind of funny. He absolutely brutalized Strive in the mid lane here. I hate the fact that they go for the Kassadin in game number 2, Rare Atom, that is. I think that is a complete waste of a pick when you already have the Elise here. I just don't think there is any synergy in that duo at all, and I think Rookie is able to take advantage of that. Jackie Love's positioning is really strong. Mark continues to help him improve and look a lot better on these engagers. They take away the Nautilus in game number 1 because they know that Southwind wants to play something more aggro. They go for the Lucian Nami, and obviously that doesn't work. Southwind cannot play enchanters at a high level, and then in game number 2, they know that RA probably is going to feel a little bit more tempted to go back to that engager style. They themselves pick up the Lucian Nami, and they look great on it. And so, overall, TES just looking solid. They did everything they needed to in this series, but the players that had the most question marks on them, or the player, I should say, that had the most question marks on him in Xingtian in the top lane, looking fantastic on the Darius, and very much deserving of the player of the series here against Rare Atom. And then for RA, yikes, this wasn't particularly good. You were willing to skirmish with TES. I think that's a good sign. I think your ability to say, like, hey, you know, we're against a team that should beat us and that they should kind of dominate us, especially in the laning phase of the game where mechanics are a little bit more paramount. Let's go ahead and just throw balls to the wall, try and make shit stick. Nidalee Renekton in game 1, Elise game 2. Let's see what we can figure out. Unfortunately, I don't love Elise Kassadin. I already talked about that a bit. I think jungle mid's a little bit lower in priority in terms of synergy than it has been in quite a long time. I think jungle top is probably the synergy you're looking for, but even Elise Camille going into the Darius, not exactly what you really want. We saw that in game number 2 as they just kind of got fed to that Darius and really weren't able to accomplish all that much, but Cube in general was just kind of useless this series, completely outplayed by his young counterpart in the other top lane. So Cube is actually going to get my dud of the series for RA. He's been really solid for them for a very long time, but this was just not one of his best series by a large margin. It felt like Top Esports was really invested into Xingtian in the top lane and trying to get him ahead, and Cube was just kind of the one that had to deal with that up there. I think Leon also played the series rather poorly. That's another series where when Leon gets behind, he's just not all that good, and I understand wanting to go for things like the Nidalee, go for things like the Elise, try to generate these early leads so that you can at least try and play it out from there, but unfortunately, it just wasn't able to work. Strive got completely outplayed in the mid lane. Awesome and Southwind really weren't anything in the bot lane. Awesome tried his best, but really Southwind was kind of poor this series, which is not a surprise to anybody who's watched Southwind for any extended period of time. We talked about him potentially being a weakness for RA going into the season, but it just kind of felt like RA was a little bit overmatched. It didn't feel like anyone particularly underperformed the expectations that we all had for them going into the season. It just felt like RA was probably not the kind of team that was going to be able to keep pace with a lot of the players on top esports. It was just not really meant to be for them. So outlook-wise, I'm not going to, bang the drum and say like, oh, they're doomed, nothing is good is going to come out. They were 2-0 for a reason going into this. I still think that they are a relatively good team. They're still sitting at above 500 in terms of game score after this one, which I think is a good sign. They're just going to need to show that they can rebound from a loss like this. If Cube, Leon, Strive can continue to get back on the right page like they were earlier in the week, I still think this could potentially be a team that competes for top 10, which they probably should be with the roster that they have. And then for top esports, good win here. You, again, kind of solidify some confidence back in yourself. Wasn't exactly the best look to lose to Weibo earlier in the year, but again, Weibo's a very good team. You were going to be able to bounce back from that, and they did so in a very dominant manner here. For Ching Tian to come in and play really well in the top lane, for Rookie to continue to dominate in the mid lane, even if Tian isn't always in the exact right spot, I think top esports still looks just as deadly as we thought they were going to be, just maybe in a different way so far in 2023. I really hope that they're able to keep it up, because the more teams that can compete at the top of the standings, the better off for the LPL. Moving on to day number 5 now, we just had a matchup between a team that was actually trying to compete for the title. Well, definitely switching gears a bit as we move into what are potentially the two worst teams in the league facing off against each other. We had LGD Gaming taking on Anyone's Legend, and LGD picks up the win in 3 games. Yikes, I mean, this AL team is in complete disaster mode. I don't even really know what to say at this point for AL. Everything is going wrong. I feel like there's at least one team in every region right now where it's just like, oh god, every single little thing is going wrong. We couldn't have predicted this, but let's talk about LGD first, because I do think that they actually looked okay in this series. Game number 1 was pretty all AL. Gotta give a lot of credit to Xiao Hao. I thought he was actually really good in game number 1 on the Sejuani. I still think he's a really good jungler on a bad team. This is a player who I actually had in my All-Pro, conversation. I'm not actually sure. People in the comments will tell me if I put him in my All-Pro last year. He was very close, if not third team All-Pro for me on AL last year, but he is just trying his best with a roster that is not there. I mean, the Sejuani game 1, he was creating so much on the map for ZDZ. He was creating it for Betty and that Varus, creating it for Pins on the Rise, who even then wasn't particularly good. It was a good showing from him. And then I think he also had a really good start in game number 2 as well on the Sej, where I don't know how AL loses this game. I mean, this is Throw City. Obviously, anybody who watched game number 2 will know that AL just simply should have won it. There was no excuse for losing that game. Betty has Jhin, and he builds Kraken Slayer. I don't even begin to understand where the thought process is there. Pins is doing negative damage as the Akali Sword Art's doing nothing. On the Heimerdinger, you end up getting to a point where Sivir's just able to take over the late game, and they end up winning. I mean, for Christ's sake, Jackson game number 2 was like 1-8-1 at 35, 40 minutes, and we'll talk about Xiaoshu certainly in a bit. He was not good in this series until the final game, but game number 3 was a little bit more standard. LGD just looking like the better team. They were able to generate a big lead early because of this, poke bot lane, the Caitlyn Ashe. Really do like when that works out for your team, but for the most part, LGD barely looks like the better team in this series. Both of these teams looked really, really bad. Honestly, this was clearly a matchup between the two worst teams in the league. I think that was very apparent when they faced off against each other, but I had to give a player of the series, and for me, honestly, Jinjiao was pretty good in this series. I know I've been a little bit critical of him over the course of the last year, but honestly, on this channel, I've started to come around on him as like a lower tier LPL support. I think, throughout a lot of last year, I was like, this guy does not deserve to have an LPL slot. But slowly but surely, as the season went on, I feel like he got more comfortable with the role. Obviously, a former AD carry, a role-swapped AD carry, getting to play in this meta, as we talked about with Wink as well on Invictus Gaming, probably beneficial to him. He spent a lot of time playing champions like Ashe in his career. To get to play that at the support position, I feel like is really beneficial to him in total, and I definitely think it worked out here in games 2 and 3, where I thought he was really solid. So Jinjiao is actually going to get my player of the series. I also want to shout out Meteor, 3 games of Maokai. He was very influential, especially in game 2 towards the back half of that game. I think that without Meteor, they're probably really struggling. Obviously, his smites are fantastic, and that's really what you notice, I think, first and foremost when it comes to Meteor and LGD, but he does a lot of good things as well. The engages are there. He just doesn't have a lot of follow-up. It's hard to carry the game by yourself on Maokai. Credit to LPC. I thought he was probably better in the series than Betty, which is not particularly what I expected going into the year, but it was the solo laners that were a little bit problematic for LGD. I don't think either mid laner was all that good. The Rise pick, I feel like you have to be like good on that champion to perform well. I don't think either player was all that good on that champion. Haichao definitely struggling a bit in game number 2 and 3. Certainly not a great performance, but dud of the series is actually going to go to the winning side, in my opinion. It's going to go to Xiaoshu. And you might look at it and say, like, well, he led his team in kills. And yeah, he had a really good game 3 on the Cassante. But honestly, games 1 and 2 were so bad on the Jax, it felt like I had no other choice but to give dud of the series to him. He was just unplayable in the first 2 games. He almost single-handedly lost them this series. In game 1, he got completely destroyed by ZDZ's Fiora. In game 2, he got completely destroyed by ZDZ's Fiora. So yeah, he had a good game number 3 on the Cassante, and that matters. It certainly is taken into account, but I think it's not enough to overpower just how bad he was through the first 2 games of this series. So Xiaoshu continues to be a little bit of a problem for LGD in the top lane, so much so that he is going to get my dud of the series here. And then moving over to AL, I mean, how do you lose the series? You win game 1 in pretty good fashion, honestly. Xiao Hao looks really good in game 1. He looks really good in game 2. Betty looks like he's kind of rolling in game 2. ZDZ looks like he's kind of rolling in game 2, but Kraken Slayer Jhin is just going to get ridiculously outscaled when your Akali is doing 0 damage, when your Heimer is constantly in bad positions. It opens up these opportunities for a champion like Sivir, for champions like Maokai to be able to get into these fights, to be able to get into these objectives, steal them off, win the fights, etc., etc., and you end up losing game 2, you end up getting trounced in game number 3. It's just disappointing. This is a team that should be so much better than they actually are. This was a team that, on paper, I thought theoretically could be a top 10 team going into the year. They are nowhere close. They are the worst team in the LPL right now. I think you could give dud of the series to anybody on this team. I think, obviously, Pins comes to mind as a player who did literally nothing, someone who I was excited for going into the year, but certainly has not performed yet. You could give it to Betty simply just for building Kraken Slayer on Jhin. I mean, how useless can you make that champion? The champion already does negative damage. To play Kraken Slayer on him, I feel like is even worse. And then Sword Art was also, again, just a complete non-factor in this series. AL just feels like they're slowly bleeding out. They're one of those teams that feels like they have no fight in them. Xiao Hao and ZDZ, I do think, are trying their best to make plays on the map, but there's only so much that AL can do to actually play the game. For the most part, they just look completely toothless, and I imagine that will continue for the rest of the year. And so, yeah, this was a matchup between the 2 worst teams in the LPL. I don't really have a ton left to say. Both of them are bad. LGD, I guess, comes out looking a little bit better, but even then, like, I don't think anybody really comes out of this looking good, and I think both teams are really just going to want to move on and hopefully try to look better in the future. That brings us to our final series of the weekday here in the LPL, the 1 through 5 regular weekdays, I should say. We had Ultra Prime taking on FunPlus Phoenix, and FPX does pick up their first win of the season, and honestly, their biggest series of the season by a large margin. This is a team that has been very close in a lot of their other series. It has gone to 3 games in every single series that they have played, but they looked pretty solid in this one. Even in the game that they lost, I would say that they still looked pretty good overall. I was actually very impressed mostly with the top side of the map here, which is kind of surprising. First thing to note, Haoya is out. He was actually someone who I was a little bit excited about going into the year. He had played okay, I would say, for FPX through their first few games. Certainly there were some problems on this team, but I think the jungle mid duo in general was playing at least fine. This team wasn't necessarily a disaster through the first couple of games, but Hacker comes in. I was definitely interested to see if Hacker was going to be the starter. They brought him in right before the season started, and so it kind of read to me as if they brought Hacker in because they weren't exactly super happy with what Haoya was doing in scrims or in practice or whatever they ended up, seeing. They saw that Hacker maybe could offer a tad bit more, so they brought him in. He is playing here after Lunar New Year, and honestly, in just this first series, it seems like the right call. Hacker came in and was honestly really good. I was a big Hacker doubter last year. He was someone who I was really high on back on his time on E-Star, if we can remember that long ago. Obviously, this Ultra Prime team, formerly known as E-Star, and he just kind of slowly got worse and worse and worse and worse every single split and every single game almost, until eventually we hit the point last year with Ultra Prime where it was like, why is this guy even in the LPL anymore? He's clearly the worst jungler in the league. He gets another shot here on FPX, a different org, a different team around him, and his first impression, pretty good. He definitely out-jungled Ning in this series. Ning had a ton of problems, which I'll talk about in a second. He was very close to getting done in the series. He doesn't end up getting a Hacker. On the other hand, does get my player of the series here for FPX. If he continues to play like this, it's a pretty easy call in my opinion, which jungler should be starting for this team. Hopefully, he's able to keep it up because Hacker is always someone who I do think has had the ability to play at an LPL level. He's just never been consistent, even remotely consistent, if I'm being honest. The other player that I think you absolutely could give player of the series to is Xiaolaohu in the top lane. This is someone who has been given a lot of chances at the LPL level, has always been in and out and in and out and in and out of this FPX lineup, going all the way back to their days with Nuguri on this team. Then, obviously, last year you had Summit come in midway through the season because Xiaolaohu just wasn't good enough to be the starter for FPX, but he's been given another shot here, and this was a very good series. He's going against one of the weaker top laners in the entire region in Harry, in my opinion, but a good series is a good series. A win is a win. If you're able to keep up this pace, that's a good thing. I do think he's been a big weakness for FPX over the past 2 or so years. To see him have a really good series here against Ultra Prime is encouraging, but it is worth noting that it isn't a particularly good team. It isn't a particularly good player that he ended up beating, and so definitely still some concern there, but KR, LWX, Lele, everybody was fine. It was really just the top side of the map that really impressed me for FPX, especially in their wins here. Xiaolaohu in game 1, and then Hacker in game number 3 in particular. And then for Ultra Prime, on the other hand, they had a lot of things go wrong in this series. I think they looked okay in game number 2, their only win. Ching did a really good job on that Syndra in game number 2 to try and keep things, you know, kind of close. He was doing a ton of damage in those late game team fights, but the games that they lost, they just looked completely incompetent. Game 1 and game 3, they didn't look like they were in the same vicinity as a team like FPX. It really does still feel like Ultra Prime is one of the bottom teams in the league, and it's not particularly close. There were a couple of candidates, in my opinion, for dud of the series here. For me, I'm going to give it to Doggo. I know we were just praising Doggo, saying like, oh, he actually maybe just had the best series that he's had in the LPL earlier in the week. Well, it was against a really bad Anyone's Legend team, and now he's back to playing against not even good teams, but just other competition, and he's back to his big mistakes, and the big mistakes are the same ones that he was making last year. He can do a lot of damage, but he is constantly out of position. I know a lot of people are going to say that there were a lot of moments where he was stepping up because nobody else on the team was actually supporting him, and he was making the right play, and the rest of the team wasn't. A lot of times at AD carry, that doesn't particularly matter. If the rest of your team is not going to support you, you cannot step up at a pro level. You have to know that sometimes it's just better to play with your team than it is to play without your team. There were so many moments where Doggo stepped up because he knew he was going to be able to get some damage out, but the rest of the team was not on the same page, so he steps up and immediately dies, and the team fight is over. He quite frankly just loses his team the game, even if it is the right call. If the rest of the team is not on the same page, then it doesn't matter. It is the wrong call in that circumstance, and so Doggo for me, going to get dud of the series, but I think you could realistically give this to Ning as well. Not only was Ning completely brutalized in the jungle matchup by Hacker, especially in game number 3 where it got completely and utterly out of control, he was so passive, and that's just not what I want to see out of a player like Ning, who has never really been passive. This was someone who just did not want to take a fight at any point in the game. Ching, Doggo, Harry, at multiple points, were trying to go in. We're trying to initiate things on this Camille, on this Zoe, on this Xayah in game number 3. And Ning just refused. He refused to actually try and make plays. I'm getting very concerned with both him and Baolan because neither of them have really looked all that good at the start of the year. Both of them look entirely passive, look like they're both, I don't want to say paycheck stealers right now, but they're not playing well, and it shows. Ultra Prime doesn't really have a lot of fight in them, a lot of chances to win. Ching looked good in game 2, but he was awful in games 1 and 3, so I don't really know what to tell you. This Ultra Prime team definitely deserves to be in the bottom 3 teams, in my opinion. They feel pretty solidified in Ultra Prime, LGD, and Anyone's Legend. Those are definitely the 3 worst teams in the LPL right now, and I think that showed in this series. Even though they have talent and they show flashes, clearly not only are they not on the same page, but they also make major mistakes. They don't have great synergy together. I just don't really see a world in which this Ultra Prime team actually competes with any of the other teams in the league. But for FPX, hopefully this is a sign of good things. They've been relatively competitive in a lot of their series. I don't think they're a bad team, but I would be surprised if this is a team that genuinely competes for a playoff spot. They just don't seem to have the talent on their roster to compete with teams that aren't like Ultra Prime, right? They started 0-2 for a reason, and so maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Xiaolaohu actually eventually turns it around. Maybe Hacker has a really good rebound season, and KR is not just left on this roster as a complete fodder player. Maybe LWX can get back to anything remotely close to what he was in 2021, but right now, it just feels like FPX was a team that is good enough to beat up on the bad teams like Ultra Prime, maybe not good enough to actually compete for a playoff spot. That's going to bring us to the start of our 2 super days, of course, in the weekend, the 3 series days, kicking off with Saturday. We had a fun series between Team WE and, oh my god, OMG. And it was a 2-0 series win for OMG in this one. However, it certainly wasn't a clean 2-0 series win for OMG, despite the fact that they were able to win both games. Both games were in WE's control until late game, where I think OMG actually proved a lot to me. Wow, I think WE certainly has some question marks in terms of that department. So let's just kind of talk about it in general. For OMG, I think the big takeaway for this series simply has to be late game decision making has improved so much from what was offered last year. Very much last year, it felt like if they weren't able to generate that early lead based off of the advantages that players like Shanji and players like Cream were able to generate in their own lanes and the 1v1s just by being very mechanically talented, they didn't really have a lot of tools to be able to pull back from deficits. But this series actually proved that quite wrong, in my opinion. A very telling series, in my opinion, from OMG here, where they were at a deficit in both of these games, where a player like Shanji was camped into hell in game number 2 on this Rumble, but was still incredibly relevant towards the back half because he paired up with his jungler incredibly well. And then Cream in game number 1 really didn't have a great impact on the Rise, but game number 2 was invaluable on this Yone. And so overall, a really good showing by OMG to show that not only are they incredibly talented early, and not only do they have really good laners like Shanji, Cream, even Abel, who is a very good laner, but their late game decision making has improved a lot as a unit. Maybe it's bringing PP God on, maybe it's just getting more comfortable playing together as a group because Shanji, Aki, Cream, and Abel are all returning from last year, but whatever it ends up being, I was really impressed with it. Aki is going to get my player of the series here in the jungle. Game number 1 on Poppy, completely invaluable. He's able to knock the Vi out of the pit, hang out of the Baron pit, and is able to pick up the Baron himself, and that basically turns the game entirely for OMG, allows them to win it. And then game number 2, some of those engages on Vi were incredibly crucial. I talk about this all the time. Vi is a pick I don't particularly love seeing from bottom teams in leagues because I don't feel like she is all that strong if you are not better than your opposition. Luckily for OMG, it very much felt like Aki was better than Hang in the late game of a lot of these games. Now, I'll talk about the early game because Aki certainly wasn't perfect there. I thought Hang actually did a really good job in game 2, in particular, being able to generate a lead for WE, being able to generate gold for WE. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to hang on to that. Towards the back half of the game, Aki did a really good job of pairing up with Shanji, who had actually been completely and utterly destroyed by Hang and Bubu throughout most of this game, and allowing that Rumble to be able to deal a lot of damage on these Vi engages. Add that on to the fact that Cream was just utterly transcendent on this Yone. I mean, Cream on melee mids, say no more, right? Like, it happens, but he was fantastic. Abel ended up hitting a point in the game on Zeri where he just becomes a teamfight menace, and the game was over at that point. Really, really good showing from OMG in my part. Even if they weren't able to generate those early leads, which is a little bit concerning against a team like WE, who isn't exactly the most talented of early game teams. You know, a player like Shanks, while he is very good early, I wouldn't necessarily consider players like Bubu and Hope necessarily giant lane threats. They really haven't been that over the course of their careers. Hope definitely more of a team fighter, Bubu more of a bad player, if I'm being entirely honest, but both were actually generally pretty good in lane. It was mostly the late game that was the problem for WE. So to see OMG and Aki in particular play so well, especially towards the back half of these games, basically always being in the right spot, always doing exactly what he needs to in order to win the game. It's very impressive from OMG, and honestly, it shows me a depth of them that I didn't know they had going into the season. I was already pretty high on this team. And then for WE, frustrating. I mean, when you have a lead in 2 straight games and aren't able to win either of them, you got to get a little bit tilted from that. I think dud of the series was actually pretty hard to hand out. I thought Hang was in a really bad spot a couple of times in game number 1. I thought Bubu's Cassante was actually fine. The bot lane was sometimes out of position. The Cassio was good. I don't really think there was any major problems with game number 1 when it came to WE, but game number 2, it felt like Shanks' rise was just not important. It felt like he was constantly reacting to a lot of plays that were happening on the map and then being late. And that's kind of what we've been seeing out of a lot of rises at both the LPL and pretty much just the global level right now, where if you're not somebody who's really far ahead on the rise, it feels like you're just reacting to a lot of these other plays and you're behind and you're not really creating that much of an impact. We're seeing this champion be prioritized incredibly highly in pick ban. And I'm just not sure it necessarily necessitates that right now. Shanks looked pretty bad on this pick in game number 2, and for that, he's actually going to get done to this series. He's really the only player in the series that felt like they had like one game that was particularly awful. I think you could talk about Shanji's game number 2 as well, where he just got camped into oblivion on this Rumble in the top lane, but he actually rebounded incredibly well and was able to output a ridiculous amount of damage towards the back half. Without that Rumble, that game is much more difficult, and so I actually want to give Shanji a little bit of props there. Obviously, his signature pick. We talked about that a ton last year on this channel, but Shanks, unfortunately, is going to get my dud of the series. Hang was actually pretty good in the series, especially in the early game where he was able to generate some leads for WE. Just wasn't able to carry it through. Bubu, for his part, honestly played kind of okay. I think this was one of his better series as a WE player. Certainly made some mistakes, especially on the Renekton, but at the end of the day, he had good moments, and that's more than you can say for most of his series on WE. And then Hope and Awandi were fine. I think Hope was out of position a lot in this series, but he was also where he needed to be. There were moments where Bubu or Shanks or somebody would just be not there in a team fight, and it would actively cost WE towards the back half of game number 2. At least Hope was trying to make plays. It very much felt like he was very stable in the early game on that Lucian Nami, and then just eventually got outscaled by Abel on the Zeri. And so overall, a little bit of a frustrating loss for WE, but there certainly are worse losses to suffer here and worse teams to lose to than OMG. And then for OMG, kind of an interesting win here. Certainly not great that you lost both early games, but kind of really good that you were able to pull it back in both games. That is a side of this team that I don't think we've really seen over the past year or so. And so generally speaking, really happy with how OMG is looking coming out of this series. Moving on to our second series here of the Saturday games, we had a pretty easy contest between an undefeated team and a winless team. And so, of course, the winless team won, because it's the LPL. Like, what are you really expecting? We had Invictus Gaming taking on ThunderTalk Gaming, and ThunderTalk picks up their first win of the season over a red-hot Invictus Gaming team, stopping them right in their 6-0 tracks going into this series. A big win for ThunderTalk. They really needed to have some semblance of life moving forward into the season, because their start has been so ridiculously horrendous compared to what their expectations were. They needed something. They needed some level of improvement, and you know what? They showed it here. They were able to take game 1. They did stumble a bit in game number 2, which we'll get to, but they took game number 3. Again, pretty back and forth, but for the most part, still a game that ThunderTalk should have won and that they played better in. And so really, really proud of this ThunderTalk team to be able to rebound and kind of step up. One roster change to actually note: Jinlu is out. Obviously, formerly known as Lucas, doesn't actually get the chance to play against his former organization because Yao Yao is back in, and anyone who follows this channel over the past year or so knows my feelings on Yao Yao. I think he was the best player on ThunderTalk last year, and I think he was a big reason why that team really started to streak down the second half of the summer split. He was in my Rookie of the Year conversation in the LPL. I'm incredibly high on him as a support. I compare him a ton to Kale in the LCK. I think they are very similar players, and he's back in here. He gets to play with Huanfeng, and man, did that help Huanfeng. I don't know if that was the difference maker, but Huanfeng had really started off the season rather slow, in my opinion. Certainly didn't have a great series in the one that we talked about earlier in the week, but he was so much better in this series, so much so that he's going to get my player of the series here for ThunderTalk. His positioning near perfect on this Ziggs that we're really not seeing a lot in the bot lane right now, but I actually love the Ziggs Jhin, especially, that they pulled out here in game number 3. I think it gives you a lot of options in terms of how you want to play the mid game. Do you want to just kind of split push and really take towers, or do you want to group around objectives? Because you do have control with the Maokai. You can basically do whatever you feel like you need to do in this game, and it gives you a lot of options, a lot of flexibility, and ThunderTalk, I think, took good advantage of that. Huanfeng's damage output was incredibly high during a lot of these games. Yao Yao set him up incredibly well, but Huanfeng was the one to execute on that, and that's why Huanfeng is going to get my player of the series here, but credit to Yao Yao. He came in and certainly made an impact for this ThunderTalk team, basically from moment one. Yucal was also fantastic again in this series. It looks like he is carrying over his summer 2022 form, where he was really starting to pick things back up for ThunderTalk. He really struggled when he joined this team earlier on in 2022, but by the time he got a little bit more comfortable, by the time he got a little bit more settled in, maybe, to playing in the LPL, to playing in China, he really started to get back onto the horse that he was on a couple of years ago in the LCK, and I think that form is definitely carried over. He's been really good to start off the year. And then Beishuan's still in. I know a lot of people were asking where their superstar 18-year-old jungler was. Well, he needs, I think, 7 days after signing a contract in order to be allowed to play in the LPL. So Beishuan, this is probably his last series playing for ThunderTalk. I'm not exactly sure. Maybe they play early next week as well, but this is probably his last series playing for ThunderTalk, and he honestly played fine. fine. I thought he played really, really well. He was able to kind of out-jungle Gideon, especially in game 1, I should say, and he looked pretty good doing it on the Elise. Game 2 wasn't exactly perfect, but I don't think anybody has like a perfect series here, and so ThunderTalk just generally looking good, especially this bot lane, which really seemed to come out of its shell. And then for Invictus Gaming, obviously it sucks to have your momentum kind of halted here, but there are positive takeaways. In my opinion, Dove was still incredibly good in this series. He has really been a pleasant surprise, I would say, this year for me. For Invictus, I was going into this year kind of thinking of Dove as the floor for this team, where I think players like Gideon, obviously you should know me, like they had a ton of upside, but I wasn't exactly sure what they were going to offer in year 1. It felt like Dove was going to be the player that we knew was going to be good, but maybe not necessarily great, and it feels like he's almost exceeded that already, where he's been a really solid mid laner for this team. Certainly not someone to overlook. That game number 2 on Azir was actually devastating. The amount of damage he was able to put out on Azir was disgusting. I think he had like 11 kills by himself in game number 2. He wasn't particularly great in game number 1 or game number 3, but that game number 2 is definitely worth pointing out because he was certainly fantastic there. On and Wink were really good in game number 3 going up against Wanfeng and Yao Yao, who were playing at a really high level, but unfortunately one major mistake in positioning from On towards the back half of the game basically costs Invictus the chance to win the series, and that's going to happen. I'm not going to blame the bot lane for the series loss, even though, you know, that death probably did cost them the game, because they were a big reason why they were in that game in the first place. On was actually playing really well on the Varus. It just wasn't meant to be. One mistake is sometimes enough to cost you the game, but there were more mistakes that led up to that point. They should have been kind of sweeping through, because the top side that I praised a lot earlier on in the season really didn't come to fruition in this one. You live by the sword, you die by the sword, and that's what You Should Know Me kind of offered you in this series. He's actually going to get my dud of the series. He was a little bit run over in this series, was certainly exploited for some of these more aggressive picks. This is kind of something that I was worried that we were going to see. Obviously, he's been pulling out some very aggressive picks in the split so far, so I was interested to see if teams were just going to hyper camp him up in the top lane with his aggressive playstyle, and so far, teams haven't really been able to do that, but this was the first series where it felt like he was definitely exploitable. Game number 1 was bad on the Jace. Game number 3 was bad on the Jace. Game number 2 on the Aurelia was pretty good, but the 2 Jace games definitely earned him done of the series, in my opinion, and like I said, you live by the sword, you die by the sword. Sometimes this is just what you're going to get with these more aggressive top laners. You're going to get games that are really good out of them. You're also going to get some games that aren't particularly good out of them. But then Gideon, also not very good in this series, was kind of just out-jungled by Beishuan, who has really struggled to get things going for ThunderTalk to start the year. And so, overall for Invictus, yes, they were, they lost this series, but I do think there were some good takeaways. This team is, at the very worst, still a lot better than anyone expected them to be. Sitting at 3-1 is still obviously a very good place to be, but even just from their showing in this series alone, I still think there are a lot of good things to take away. The bot lane is probably for real. This was a good performance from a bot lane, even in a loss that really struggled to play from behind last year. I think the improvement that these two have shown is definitely noticeable. Their mid lane seems to be very, very solid. If you get the good performances out of top and jungle, it just feels like this team can beat anyone in the league, even still coming out of the series, and so I'm not particularly worried about Invictus. I think they might struggle with consistency just because of the style that some of the players on the team play, but at the end of the day, that's kind of the risk that you have to take in the LPL to be one of the best teams in the league. But for ThunderTalk, really good bounce back rebound series here. You needed to get your first win of the season into week 3, and you got it here against a very good team. I think bringing Yao Yao in is certainly going to be a decision that probably makes them look better. It'll be interesting to see if their young jungler can make them look better as well, with Yukal and Wanfeng definitely stepping it up, at least in this series. And so kind of interested to see where ThunderTalk moves from here on out, but definitely in contrast to where they were earlier in the week. Moving on to our third and final game of the Saturday games here in the weekend, we had a really, really fun series, one that I was very much looking forward to, between two of the best teams in the LPL. We had Bilibili Gaming taking on Weibo Gaming, both teams playing their first series of the week here. And BLG is able to take the series 2-1 in 3 games. Super impressive performance from the jungle here in BLG. I'm just going to get straight into it, because the jungle performance that June was able to offer both in games 1 and game 3, incredibly impressive. Not only did he control the map, he was able to be super useful in the early game with a lot of very impactful ganks, but he also was able to translate that lead into late game pressure, even in a game number 3 on a champion like Nidalee that doesn't particularly have a lot of pressure in a game 3. I think he just played fantastic. It is a very easy choice for player of the series, in my opinion, here with June. I was very interested to see how June was going to play, obviously moving over to BLG here. He's someone who I've been very high on Invictus Gaming for quite a few years now. It felt like he was the player on that team that was trying his best to actually win games when the rest of the team was really struggling. June comes over to a team with expectations and a team that really wants to win right now in BLG. Struggled a little bit in the opening weeks, but definitely has rebounded a bit here after the Lunar New Year and has looked really good, or looked really good, I should say, in this series here. He certainly wasn't the only player, but we're not seeing a lot of players really succeed on Kindred in the early game. I talked about this on the channel. I know Kindred's incredibly broken in solo queue right now, but at the pro level, it just really hasn't been the same kind of pick that it is in solo queue. And then Nidalee's very similar, where, yes, you can take over games on Nidalee, but you have to be incredibly proficient on Nidalee, because not only do you need to win that early game, but you have to know how to transition leads from the mid game into the late game, which is something that Nidalee players have always struggled with at a pro level, even some of the best ones. And so for June to do those, both of those things, I would say, so efficiently over the course of the series was incredibly impressive. Big credit to Bin in the top lane. I thought some of his engages, especially in Game 3 on the Jax, were incredibly good. Elk was really solid, incredibly bloodthirsty in a lot of the series, was really looking for kills. Yagal followed up well. On did a really good job, especially on these more Enchanter type picks, but even on the Heimer in game number 3, it just felt like BLG was kind of clicking in this series. Even in their game 2 loss, it just felt like the team wasn't exactly perfect in that game. Yagal was overextending, Bin was overextending a bit, but I mean, for the most part, this team looked fantastic. I loved their game 1. I thought they were incredibly dominant there, and then game 3, while it was close, it very much felt like it was always in BLG's control because of how good June was playing in the jungle, and so really, really enjoyed what BLG was able to do here, but let's get to the elephant in the room. I really kind of rushed through that BLG section because I do want to take some time here to talk about something for Weibo, and that is Karsa. And I know I'm going to shock a lot of people by saying this. Karsa's my dud of the series, but before we get into that, let me say, I'm so freaking tired of Reddit sitting here and looking at a player and seeing a bad game or 2 bad games, or having a narrative for a player and saying, they're doomed. The amount of comments that I have read, I just want to get into this because it really is something that bothers me. I usually don't talk about this in videos, but it is something that genuinely is starting to bother me. The amount of comments that you see saying, Karsa shouldn't be in the LPL. This team should pick up View as a free agent because Karsa is so bad. It's just mind-boggling. Like, to me, it either is the fact that these people aren't watching the games, because I don't think that you could watch a lot of these games and say that Karsa doesn't deserve to be in the LPL. Yes, he had a bad performance in game number 3. We will get to that, and he wasn't good in game number 1 either. But it completely ignoring any of the other games that he's played this season is not fair. Completely ignoring all the good games he had last split before he kind of fell off a cliff is not fair, right? Like, we're pretending like Karsa can't play League of Legends. We're pretending like he's not a top 8 at worst jungler in the league. Like, there are not a lot of good junglers in the LPL. I get that Karsa may not be number 1 or number 2 or number 3, but pretending like he is garbage and unplayable just isn't right and isn't fair. I don't know how to say not fair to someone who's probably making millions of dollars, right? But this narrative has completely spiraled out of control, and this is just something I want to talk about because this is what social media does. Reddit in particular, I think, does this a ridiculous amount, is they find a player that they all unanimously just decide to not like, and then they pile on him. It's every single bad game that happens from there on out. It's like, oh, this is why, this is why, this is why, and then you look at the post-match threads of the ones where they do play well, and it's complete silence. Absolutely no one talking, no one speaking up, but that one game where they start to play bad, oh, there's 1,000 comments about why they shouldn't be in the LPL, etc., etc., etc. There are multiple players that could go on about this in the league, not just the LPL, but it's mostly the LPL. And it's just frustrating as a fan because a big reason why I wanted to start this channel is because I feel like there is such a lack of genuine analysis out there. It always comes with this level of bias of, you know, this group of people has just decided to hate this player and has decided that anything this player does that is good will be ignored and anything bad this player does will be praised. And there's sometimes the opposite. Sometimes there are just like hype trains for no reason where this player will do some things well and they will get hyped up into oblivion on Reddit and then they'll underperform and no one will say anything, right? Like, I feel like the narratives and the biases surrounding a lot of players, especially in the LPL, are just out of control. And I really do feel like that's why this series is so important. And so, yes, Karsa's my dud of the series. He got completely out-jungled in games 1 and 3. And maybe he didn't deserve player of the game in game 2. I say he did. I think he was the most impactful member of Weibo in Game 2, but if you want to give it to the Shy, who played really well in Cassante, I completely understand. But one thing I do need to say is, watching all of Weibo's games, especially their series against Top Esports, which either these people didn't watch or they just don't care. Watching that series, you can't tell me that Karsa doesn't deserve to be in the LPL and that he doesn't deserve to at least be considered for a top team, because he played fantastic in their wins. He's just another jungler that is really good from ahead and not so good from behind. I don't really see what the big difference is between him and a player like Tian, who I get Tian's just like a better version of this, but again, both junglers are incredibly streaky, and they're good from ahead and bad from behind. It's the kind of position right now that is very difficult to play from behind. And so to sit here and say, yeah, Karsa's early games aren't perfect, you're right. You're right, they're not perfect. But there aren't a lot of perfect early game junglers in the league. People have just decided that Karsa is the worst and has no value and etc, etc. They just ignore his good performances like he had in game number 2, where he completely controlled the map and completely stifled everything that Yagao and Jun wanted to do in the mid game, or pretty much the entirety of the TES series. You just ignore it. And so that's my little rant aside. Karsa is still done of the series, let me say, because his game 1 and game 3 weren't great, but I have to say, just the narrative around him has just spiraled so far out of control, it honestly just makes me mad at this point. So sorry for rant, but it's just something I wanted to get off my chest. The Shy was really good in game 2, not so good in games 1 and 3, where he kind of got run over. Xiaohu, Light, Crisp, none of them really accomplished all that much. Xiaohu in particular was not good on the Rise. I keep talking about this. Rise feels very much like a trap pick right now. I understand that it can be used very well in a lot of regions, but God, I just haven't seen it like it consistently. You know, sometimes it looks good, most of the time it looks bad, and that really does worry me that teams are prioritizing it so highly. And another 2 games of Rise that look completely bonkers here for Weibo, and so overall, just a series and I think a general perception that I disagree with. I think both of these teams are really good. I think Weibo just got a little bit outclassed in this series. Jun was fantastic, and he was the best player on the map, and sometimes that is going to happen. Sometimes the best player on the map is going to be on the enemy team. I think they did their absolute best, especially in game 2, where I do think they looked solid. The Shy and Karsa, in particular, looked really, really good in game number 2, but this series really was about Bin. It was about Jun in particular, and then Elk, I thought, also looked really solid for BLG. Kind of the typical members of BLG that have really been performing early on into the season. This is a huge win for that team and for that organization, and it really does make things interesting moving into the rest of the year. That's going to bring us to our final day of LPL action here in week number 3. Of course, this video is ridiculously long, like all the LPL videos are, because there's just so many games, but we're finally in the final 3 series here, and we kicked off our Sunday games with Top Esports taking on Ninjas in Pyjamas. And Top Esports picks up a win here in 3, although, you know, in game 2, well, it certainly was an outlier. Ninjas in Pyjamas won it, but games 1 and 3 were not particularly close. Top Esports was clearly the better team in this series, and I don't even think it was really all that up for debate. So, let's go ahead and talk about it, shall we? Top Esports looked really good in this series. Obviously, some problems we'll get into, but for the most part, their core is looking good. I think Tian looked solid. He certainly had some moments at the beginning of the year where he didn't look particularly great, but 3 straight games of Sejuani, that'll get you right back into form. And then, really, the 2 big standouts for me, the 2 carry roles, Rookie and Jackie Love, each kind of getting a game to their own here. Rookie in game number 1, Jackie Love in game number 3, to kind of really separate themselves. Rookie, when he gets on these more aggressive, I don't want to say like, fight-oriented mid laners, but, something like the Silas, I think he can really stand out, really look fantastic. And I think Rookie, to that point, was a pretty clear choice for my player of the series here. He's been the most consistent player of Top Esports over the course of their first couple series so far this year, and I don't expect that to change all that much. That really has been Rookie's dynamic. I talked about that earlier in the week in this Top Esports series as well, that Rookie is kind of the guy that I would expect to perform pretty much all the time, even in their losses, especially in their wins. I think Rookie is going to be the one to step up. The Silas game was fantastic in game 1, but even the Azir game in game number 3 was also pretty good. Jackie Love really, really looking good on that Twitch in game number 3, getting back to that more hyper carry style that we know Jackie Love loves to play. That's really where he was making his name for himself. Early on in his career on Invictus Gaming, it was on hyper carries like Twitch, and I think going back to that here as a style for Top Esports definitely fits kind of the mold that they want to go for. We know that Jackie Love and Mark work super well together as a duo. I think both bringing out the best in each other because they're both so ridiculously aggressive, and I think that definitely plays up, playing into that more hyper carry role where if you can generate that lead onto Jackie Love, he's just going to dominate the game more so than almost any other AD carry in the entire region. So Rookie and Jackie Love both looking really good here. Rookie is going to get my player of the game, though. One player that I do want to point out is Tian. Definitely a step back from what he was earlier in the week, but let's not forget, I mean, this guy looked really, really good earlier in the week. Obviously, different competition, whatever, say what you want, but Tian is certainly not someone that I'm going to pull the trigger on just yet. I see a lot of people, again, on Reddit, and I hate bringing up Reddit because, honestly, who takes their opinion seriously? But I see a lot of people on Reddit saying, like, wow, how bad must Wayward be to play this guy? I think Tian has shown a lot so far in his small time in the LPL that has given him the opportunity to earn this starting job. And I think so far, at least from what we've seen, he's earned it. And we'll talk about the other top laner here. I think this series and kind of how he played really bad this week, but this series was really good from Invincible. And so I'm not going to sit here and say that Tian is the worst player in the world or anything like that. I certainly don't hate the idea of playing him over Wayward. I think both are probably relatively close in skill level, if not almost identical. I think they're probably just about the same player, and so to go for one over the other, not particularly all that important to me, but Tian wasn't all that great in this series, certainly was the weak link of TES, but it wasn't, heavy enough for Rookie and Jackie Love to have any sort of problems winning this game. But for Ninjas in Pyjamas, they really are starting to have some problems, especially in this mid lane. I'm going to talk about it first because Dream actually gets benched after game number 1. He has a horrendous game number 1 on Talia. He has been really bad to start the year. This is someone who I think a lot of people had at least decent expectations for going into the year, so they actually bring in this guy, Pout. I'm very unfamiliar with him. Didn't actually get any chance to watch any film on him going into this year. I know he played in Turkey for Supermassive, but I didn't actually get to watch any of those games, so I don't know how good he is. He looked okay in this series, I guess. He was still pretty bad, in my opinion. Both of them were the worst players on NIP over the course of these 3 games, and so they're getting a combined dud of the series here, but this is mostly for Dream, because he truly does deserve it at this point. Not only was he awful in game number 1, got completely rolled by Rookie on the Silas, but he's been bad all year long. He's been getting rolled by basically everybody that they've played against that has any sort of pulse in the mid lane. And so Dream getting benched, I'm not particularly surprised with how he's playing, but I know a lot of people are really high on him, me included, going into the year and wanted to see some good expectations out of him. That certainly hasn't come true. Photic and Juo were nothing in this series. Xiao and Bao was getting kind of thrashed by Tian in a lot of these early games, and so the Maokai really wasn't all that useful. And honestly, the most impressive player for NIP was Invincible. That game number 2 on Jax was awesome. Like, he crushed Tian, and then he was able to really move that pressure around the map. This is, I guess, why Invincible is starting, because I do think his upside is probably a little bit higher than what Rich can offer you. Yes, Rich is probably going to be more consistent in what he is going to give you, which is a weak laner, but a good team fighter, kind of that impact style of play, that presence in the top lane where you kind of feel good about knowing what you're going to get out of him. But I think Invincible, upside-wise, in terms of carry potential, has just shown a lot more than someone like Rich has, and so I do understand not playing Rich if you feel like, first of all, if you feel like Rich has given you a lot of problems as an organization, which, first of all, I don't agree with, whatever, man, like, let the player, express himself, but whatever. If you want to play Invincible, I don't think it's, like, objectively the wrong move from a gameplay standpoint. I think Invincible's upside is higher than Rich's, but his floor, I will note, is much lower. We've seen that over the years so far. His bad games are going to look a lot worse than Rich's, but I think his good games are also going to look a lot better. The game number 2 here for NIP, I don't think Rich could have. Rich is not going to have a game like that. And so a lot of good, a lot of bad to take away from NIP here. I think for the most part, though, I'm starting to get concerned. They're sitting at 1-3. I think that record does kind of live up to how they've played. They have played some good teams, but for the most part, I wanted to see them at least be relatively competitive, and it felt like even in their win in game 2 where Invincible looked really good, the rest of the team didn't really do all that much, and this mid lane spot is starting to look like a little bit of a black hole for NIP. If they don't figure that out, they're going to be in a lot of trouble. There are simply too many good mid laners in the LPL to have a really bad player at that spot. And then for top esports, we already talked about it earlier in the week. This is one of the best teams in the entire league. Game number 2 felt like a blip, an outlier on the radar. It really feels like this team was just so much better than NIP in this series. Rookie continues to be fantastic. Jackie Love, when he's given the opportunity, is going to be good. Tian's consistent. I don't love him as a superstar player, but he's a very, very good jungler to have. And even if Tian is a little bit of a weakness in the top lane, I don't think it's enough to really stop this team from being good. I don't really think it's all that different from them having Wayward in the top lane last year. And so for me, top esports, still a team that I'm going to consider in the upper echelon of LPL teams. Moving on to our second series, though, of the final 7th day here in the LPL. We had a fun one between Rare Adam and LNG Esports, and LNG really does keep the ball rolling here. They looked unbelievable in game number 2, which we will get to in a second. But even through game number 1, they looked really, really solid. And let me say this, let me preface this early. I know they really haven't faced a ton of really good competition, but to go 6-0 as dominantly really as they have through the first 3 weeks of the season is a good sign. Like, I don't think that there is much more that you could ask this LNG team to do through the first couple weeks of the season. They have accomplished every single thing that they have set themselves out to do. All of their players look really solid, and even the ones that we were kind of concerned about have really stepped up, in my opinion, and shown the big reason why they were chosen maybe over some of the other people that were available. So let's talk about LNG. How can you not talk about Scout? I mean, this was one of the most dominant performances. This was probably the best single game performance that the LPL, I almost called it the LCS, that the LPL has had in 2023 so far. This was incredible on Rise in game number 2. I mean, it really is worth checking out like a highlight reel of the game if you have time to do so, just to see how dominant Scout was in a lot of these team fights. He plays the Kassadin in game 1, and he's really strong on it. Let me say that. Like, he does a really good job playing the Kassadin into Strive, but really, it's game number 2. He goes like 15-1 in game number 2, where he is just so ridiculously dominant on this Rise. He's able to control the lane push. He's able to completely roam to every play before Strive has any opportunity to do anything. He's in side lanes. He's in team fights. He's just everywhere on the map. Like, he is just dominating. This is genuinely one of the best performances that I've seen in the LPL all year long. Very easy choice for player of the series here to go to Scout, who just looks great on LNG. I was actually kind of concerned with how he was going to look outside of the EDG ecosystem. Now, obviously, I wasn't concerned that he was a good player, but we've seen Tarzan kind of struggle with more resource-oriented mid laners in the past, a player like Doenby. And so I was kind of concerned that maybe that was going to be a problem again here with Scout. How are they going to fit together? Was bringing in Hang going to work, considering he had such a up and down year in 2022? Well, yeah, it's all worked out super well. Tarzan and Scout have some fantastic synergy together. Tarzan getting back to his more tank-oriented, facilitating style that he was known for when he was back on Griffin back in the day. And so to see that come back out here, he gets to play with Scout, who really can carry games still at this level. Hang is a fantastic engaged player, and he's being allowed to do so even in a meta where it's not particularly great to do so. He's still a great enchanter player too. I don't want to put that past him. But it's the two players that I was more concerned about going into the year that have stepped up and really been solid for me. Zeke, obviously, we already talked about a bit in the previous series. He was player of the series earlier in the week, but LP has really stepped up. I think that there are a lot of players that would not be playing nearly as well in LP's situation. He knows exactly what his limits are, and he plays to them. He knows he doesn't have to win the game for his team. He knows he just has to be solid in team fights, be there at fights, be in positions where he can help his team out. He doesn't have to be the superstar on a team with Tarzan, on a team with Scout, and he's not trying to be, and I think it really is helping LNG out a lot. I think if he was trying to take over a lot of these games, bring a lot of resources bot lane, I do think it would be to the detriment of what LNG is actually able to accomplish so far this year. And so they're looking really good. I actually really, really like the way they look. They're way over exceeding my expectations of them, and I really hope they can keep it up. As for Rare Atom, not particularly surprising that they were kind of run off the map by a better LNG team here, but it is worth noting that nobody in this team really played well in this series, and I'll get to that in a second. Dud of the series was actually kind of hard to pick, because I don't think anybody played particularly good, especially their carry roles, but I'm going to give it to Awesome in the bot lane, who just felt like he had zero impact on the game, especially in game 2. It just felt like he was being picked off over and over and over again. It's almost like he forgot that Rise has a point-and-click stun that he can get off on you if you are in the wrong position. This Varus was just constantly not in a good spot and was constantly being killed over and over again. And so for me, Awesome's going to get it. I think you could realistically give it to Southwind. You could give it to Strive, who was completely run over in lane, especially in game number 2 on the Kassadin, which is just such an ego pick to pull out here in game number 2 against Scout and against Scout's Rise, his best champion, because you're just hoping that you get to level 11 relatively even. You weren't going to get to level 11 relatively even here. And then Leon, again, got an early lead. He was winning against Tarzan, but as is Leon's, signature move, he threw the lead towards the mid game. Tarzan did a really good job of being able to take a lot of the advantages that his lanes offered him. And then Cube was fine in the top lane. He's just Cube. He's going to do what he does. But overall, Rare Atom didn't really have a lot of good in them in this series. They kind of just got beaten. It was Leon who was generating some early leads, and Awesome was doing damage, but for the most part, it was at the cost of his own life, which when you're super far behind, isn't particularly worth it because you have nobody else to actually follow up and make use of that damage. Sometimes when you're super far ahead, that can be a useful tool in order to kind of facilitate a lot of these team fight initiations, but, when you're super far behind and you are the damage on the team, probably not the right call to make. And so Not a lot of really good smart play here from Adam, but that's kind of been their MO over the course of the year so far, and even last year it was as well, is this team does have mechanical skill. I think Strive, Leon, awesome. They're talented players. Cube is a very talented player, but they just don't make the right decisions. They're always in the wrong spots, they take the wrong fights, and it really holds them back from being a good team. It's the reason I had them ranked very low in my preseason power rankings. I think I had them at 14 or 13, one of those two spots. Like, I didn't have them near playoffs. I didn't really have them as a team that was going to be competing in playoffs. I had them in the D tier, and it's because I just didn't really look at this roster and say, like, wow, this is a team that is going to compete with some of the top teams in the league or is going to have a shot. It didn't really feel like that was going to be all that reasonable for me to say, and I think that has kind of come true. I see a lot of people saying that this team has talent, they just need to get their head together. Yes, this team has talent. I don't know if they have top 10 talent. They probably have like 11, 12, 13 level talent, and then they might be like 14 or 15 in terms of macro, and I think that's probably where they're going to fall, somewhere around like 13, 14 in terms of teams around them in the standings. They're a decent team, but certainly not one that I would expect to compete for a playoff spot as we move further in the year. And then LNG, they just look really solid right now. Going undefeated, being the only team other than JDG to be undefeated up till this point. They have the most wins being undefeated, I will definitely say, is a very good thing. Now, it's going to be interesting to see what happens when they finally start getting tested against actually good teams, because so far they really haven't played anybody all that tough. But this team actually is rolling right now. If Tarzan and Scout can continue to be on the same page, if LP continues to be a really solid weak side bot lane, I actually think LNG is going to be a pretty scary team, and one that genuinely does compete for top 4 as we move further in the year. That's going to bring us to our final series of the week. Thank you guys for sticking around so long in this video. I really do appreciate it. But let's go ahead and talk about it. We had a matchup between LGD Gaming and Royal Never Give Up. And EDG picks up the 2-0 series win. RNG, even with Ming, continues to be completely hapless and completely hopeless. Before we talk about them, though, because there is a lot to talk about when it comes to RNG, let's talk about EDG first and foremost. It's a good bounce back after what was a horrendous loss earlier in the week to Invictus Gaming that they really could not afford to have happen. JJ played really terrible in that series, so did Ale, and I think both of them really stepped up in this series, in my opinion. JJ's actually going to get my player of the series for EDG. It's been a long time since I've seen this level of map control come out against a team and a player that is really good at it in Wei. Wei is typically very good at making sure the map is in RNG's favor, that even when they're not ahead in gold, that they have opportunities to be able to trade back somewhere else on the map. It's something that I always thought RNG was particularly good at, but man, JJ just completely stifled them from that in this series. A really good game 1, and even better game number 2, where it just felt like, oh god, there's nothing on the map for RNG to take. They have no objectives, they have no towers, they have no minion waves even at points that are completely free. Like, it's just very difficult for them to play the game. A lot of that was due to the pressure that was put on them, I should say, by JJ in the jungle, and I thought he did a really good job with that. So much so that he definitely deserved player of the series, in my opinion, although I think realistically, another player that also deserved it is going to be Fofo, who I've actually been really low on, I would say, over the course of the year so far. He's someone who was just bad last year. Icon was simply better than him on BLG, and he deserves to get replaced, and then he comes over here to EDG, has been given a lot of responsibility early on in the year, and hasn't exactly always lived up to the hype, was certainly not particularly good in that Invictus Gaming series earlier in the week, but did a much better job in this series. Good game 1 on Jace, but it's the game 2 on Akali that I really want to talk about. I mean, Gala has PTSD for this Akali for a reason. This is a champion, obviously, that he is notoriously, laughably in PTSD for, and Fofo definitely showed why in this series. His game number 2, he was just blowing up that Lucian at every single possible moment. It was Vi going in, it was Akali going in, Gala didn't get to play the game at all, and Fofo was a big part of that. And so this jungle mid duo doing a really good job to rebound after what was a pretty horrendous showing earlier on in the week. Obviously, Ale playing Sion in game number 2 and not dying. That's certainly, I think, a good sign. I'm not really sure what to take from that, but after having such a poor series earlier in the week, to see him bounce back with a good game of Sion is good. Leave really picked up a lot of kills. Mako looked a lot better in the series. And also congratulations to Mako. He just had his 500th career win here in game number 2. He's the first player in LPL history to ever reach that milestone. Obviously, he's number 1 in LPL history in terms of wins, and he just continues to do it. He continues to be fantastic. Even with a rookie here in the bot lane in Leave, EDG still looks really, really fun to watch, and Mako's a great player. So shout out to this jungle mid, shout out to Mako. Honestly, EDG really clicked in this series. But It's more about RNG just continuing to struggle. It is worth noting, Ming is in. Like, he is signed, he is in, and it did not help, at least in game number 1 here for RNG. He looked okay, but Gala was just, meat to the slaughterhouse right now for Akali and for Vi and for everybody basically in game number 2. It was actually disgusting to watch. Is worth noting, no Angel here in the mid lane. Tong Yuan is going to be their mid laner, at least as of right now, and I don't know what Angel must be doing in scrims to have Tong Yuan be playing, but he's not particularly good, so Angel must be even worse somehow in scrims. I would hate to see him be contract jailed or something like that. Like, I don't know. RNG has a bad history with players, but I can't imagine they would be that transparent about doing something shady to a player. That seems like almost just the wrong decision. A lot of the players that struggled earlier in the week continued to struggle here. Wei got completely out jungled by JJ. He has been bad to start the year. There really is no other way to put it. We've talked about Bunny kind of being this big black cloud, I would say, over RNG, just generally speaking, for the start of the season. But Wei has been equally as bad. This is someone who I think has really, really been frustrating to watch over the start of the season. It's almost like he's just not the same player that he was the past few years. And then Breathe, another game where he really started to struggle. It just seems like everything on RNG is going wrong right now. Unfortunately, Gala's going to get my dud of the series just because that game number 2 on the Lucian. It's not even entirely his fault. Again, he just got punished over and over again by Akali, by Vi, even by the Zeri, right? Like, everybody took their turn beating up on Gala, and I feel bad for him, but at the end of the day, like, he was nothing in game number 2. He was the least impactful player on the team. Even a player like Tong Yuan, who I think really was bad this series, had impact. Even a player like Wei, who got completely out-jungled and had 0 map pressure, at least made some plays on the Wukong, could initiate. There was no damage, there was no survivability, there was basically nothing coming out from Gala, even if it wasn't entirely his fault as a player. And so for RNG, I mean, you're really at the point now where you've just got to hope and pray that something changes, because there aren't a lot of things left that you can do. Angel can come back in, but after that, like, what else do you really have here for RNG? What else are you really looking forward to as big upgrades? Hopefully Ming can reacclimate himself, but there really shouldn't be a big acclimation process for a player that played with almost every player on this team last year, and they made Worlds doing it. So I don't really know where exactly you're going to be looking at for RNG, but this team right now looks like underperformance city. This team might not even be like top 7, top 8 right now in the league, and that is completely unacceptable for a team that went to Worlds last year and changed almost nothing. And then for EDG, very big win here, good bounce back. I'm still not entirely sold that they're like a top 4 team in the league or anything like that. Certainly the top 4 feels very difficult to break into right now, but they're a good team. They may just not be a great team. It's going to be interesting to see if they can continue to grow, continue to build. That jungle mid duo I think is going to matter a lot for how this team performs, because I feel pretty confident that the bot lane is actually just going to be fine, which is crazy because that's the rookie, but Mako makes every bot lane he's ever played with fine, and so leaving Mako I feel pretty good about. If the jungle and mid can continue to perform like this though, I have a feeling EDG is going to surpass a lot of expectations. Alright, that is going to do it for my LPL Week 3 overview and analysis of all 7 days of action. Up on your screen right now, you're going to see the updated LPL standings after Week 3. Of course, in the first column to the right, you're going to see my updated power rankings. In the second column that says change, you're going to see how those have changed from last week to this week. So it's time to go over the biggest risers and the biggest fallers of the week. A couple of ties here for biggest riser. We'll kind of talk about them all at the same time. Starting off with LNG going up +2 from number 7 to number 5. They looked really solid this week. They continue to look like a team that definitely deserves to be in that upper echelon, because a lot of the other teams around them really aren't consistent at all. If they continue on their pace, even if they're not, one of the top 4 teams, which do feel pretty locked in right now, I still feel pretty confident that they are a strong team nonetheless. Other risers, Invictus Gaming jumping up to number 8 from number 10. They look good in their win over EDG. I understand they kind of got their momentum stopped by ThunderTalk, but if anything, that kind of showed me that this team, even in loss, can still be competitive, and they're going to live by the sword and die by the sword, which makes me think that they are at least going to be a competitive, fun team no matter who they play against, and I think that is going to be a huge positive for them. They have solidified their spot in the top 10, in my opinion. Other +2 riser this week is going to go to OMG, jumping from number 9 to number 7. They were actually really, really convincing this week, even though their series itself wasn't particularly great. What they showed me is that they have the wherewithal to be able to come back from series that they're down in, and so felt really good about those 3 teams in particular. But biggest faller this week should be no surprise to anybody. It's going to be RNG, dropping down 3 spots from number 6 to number 9. They're right on the edge of that falling out of the playoffs, right? I think I still have faith that this team has the talent to be able to turn it around, but if they don't get their act into gear soon, they are going to fall out of that top 10. They're certainly not playing like a top 10 team right now, but I have faith that the talent on the roster will be able to make it work as we move further on in the season. Other followers in multiple spots, Weibo falling down to number 4 after their loss to Bilibili. I still think they're a good team, but top 4 you can put in, or at least I would say 2 to 4, you can basically put in whatever order you feel most comfortable in. I feel like all of those teams are all relatively good. Nip, Ninjas, and Pyjamas falling down to number 10. They are very lucky I did not knock them out of the top 10, but right now, that like 10 to 12 or 13 range feels very close to me, and I just have them. They have the most talent on their roster, so they're going to stick at number 10. And then Anyone's Legend proving that they are the worst team in the league, falling down to number 17. But let's go ahead and talk about Player of the Week and Dud of the Week. My Player of the Week here in Week 3 of the LPL is going to go to Cream on OMG, who I thought was really, really good. Got a lot of his signature picks this week. His melee mids that we know he loves to dominate on. Things like the Yone that we really love to see come out of him. He was fantastic. Almost under the radar good this week. Really, really liked seeing him play. I think that there were a lot of options. I think other mid laners that I considered, because it really was kind of the week of mid lane here in the LPL. Of course, Scout on LNG, who just had that phenomenal game towards the back half of the week. And then, of course, Rookie on top Esports. I think were all considerations. But for me, I'm going to give Player of the Week to Cream on OMG. And then my Dud of the Week for me, another pretty easy choice. It's going to go to Dream on NIP. Dream getting replaced, getting benched for a player that I've basically never heard of. Not a good sign for NIP. It remains to be seen if he's back in the starting lineup when they play next week, but it'll be interesting to see what happens. He has basically played his way out of the LPL over the start of the season. It felt like a no-brainer to call Dream my Dud of the Week here on NIP and to call Cream my Player of the Week on OMG. Didn't mean for it to rhyme, but that's kind of fun. But that's going to do it. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, let me know down in the comment section below. Of course, if you stuck around for this almost 2-hour-long video, leave a like on the video. It really does mean a lot. Of course, if you are new here, hit that subscribe button. It helps out the channel. Of course, not only do I put out LPL content, it's all 4 major regions as well as the NACL. And so if you're looking for complete and thorough LCS and LEC and LCK analysis as well, check out the channel. Hit that subscribe button. It really means a lot to me. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all later.